The frontier didn't forgive. It didn't forget. And it sure as hell didn't care if you were innocent. Ernie Hale learned that lesson mile by miserable mile as he pushed west through land so harsh it seemed designed by something cruel and ancient. The Wyoming Territory stretched before him like an open wound, red rock canyons that swallowed sound, alkali flats that burned the eyes, wind that never stopped screaming through the sage. 3 days out from the town that nearly hanged him, his supplies ran thin. Jerky that tasted like boot leather, water that needed boiling twice to be trusted, coffee grounds he'd already reused so many times they barely colored the water brown anymore. But Ernie had been here before, not in this exact stretch of hell, but in places just like it. He'd been drifting since he was 16 when his father's farm in Missouri burned and took his family with it. The frontier had a way of collecting men like him, the dispossessed, the damaged, the ones who'd lost everything and found that nothing weighed less than anything. He was a good shot, better than good. His hands were steady and his eyes were quick, and somewhere along the way he'd learned that a man with a gun and no attachments could always find work. Sometimes that work was legal, more often it wasn't. He'd ridden with cattle drives and guarded payrolls, and once, during a winter so cold his tears froze, he'd tracked down a horse thief for a rancher in Colorado who paid him in gold coin and didn't ask questions. He wasn't proud of what he'd become. But pride was a luxury, like clean sheets and hot meals, and Ernie Hale had learned to live without luxuries. On the 4th day, his horse started limping. "Easy, girl," he murmured, dismounting to check her leg. A stone lodged near the frog of her hoof. Nothing fatal, but enough to slow them down. He dug it out with his knife, whispering apologies Sable couldn't understand and probably wouldn't care about, even if she could. The delay cost him. By the time he remounted, the sun was dropping fast, painting the canyon walls in shades of rust and amber. He needed to find water before dark, find shelter, find something other than empty land and emptier sky. That's when he saw the wagon. It sat crooked in the middle of a dried creek bed, one wheel shattered, cargo scattered like a child's abandoned toys. No horses, no driver, just silence and the smell of death starting to sweeten in the heat. Ernie approached with his hand on his pistol, eyes scanning for trouble. Bandits sometimes set traps like this. Wreck a wagon, wait for a good Samaritan to investigate, then rob him blind and leave his body for the coyotes. But there were no bandits, just a man. He lay half under the wagon's shadow, dressed in black from collar to boot. Even from 20 feet away, Ernie could see the preacher's garb, the high white collar, the simple cross on a leather cord, the Bible still clutched in fingers already going stiff. Dead. Maybe 2 days, judging by the bloat. Ernie dismounted and approached slowly, out of respect or habit, or maybe just because the sight of death always deserved caution. The preacher's face was young, couldn't have been more than 30, with soft features that suggested he'd never gone hungry, never fought, never learned the hard lessons the frontier taught. "Sorry, friend," Ernie said quietly. "Wrong place, wrong time." He should have buried him, should have said some words, maybe carved a marker. But the ground here was hardpan and rock, and Ernie's supplies were low, and the living had to keep living even when the dead deserved better. He was turning to leave when he saw the letter. It stuck out from the preacher's jacket pocket. Fine paper, sealed with red wax that had already melted and rehardened in the heat. The address was still legible. Reverend Thomas Blackwell. Red Hollow, Wyoming Territory. Urgent. Town in desperate need. Ernie stared at it for a long moment. Then, hating himself a little, he reached down and pulled it free. The seal broke easily. Inside, the handwriting was feminine, elegant despite the urgency bleeding through every word. Reverend Blackwell, we are a town without hope. Our men are afraid. Our women weep in secret. Our children know only fear. A devil named Victor Kane controls everything. The land, the law, even our lives. We have begged the territorial governor for help. We have written to the army. No one comes. You are our last prayer. Please, Reverend. Red Hollow needs a man who can remind us what faith looks like, what courage looks like. We need someone to stand between us and the darkness. Come quickly, before there's nothing left to save. Margaret Fairchild. Schoolteacher, Red Hollow. Ernie read it twice. Then he looked down at the dead preacher, at his soft hands and his clean collar and his Bible that had probably never been used for anything harder than Sunday comfort. "You weren't going to save them," Ernie said to the corpse. "You were going to get yourself killed." The wind picked up, carrying dust and the distant cry of a hawk. Ernie's horse stamped nervously, ready to move, ready to be anywhere but here. He should ride on. This wasn't his fight, wasn't his town, wasn't his problem. But the letter kept pulling his eyes back. A town without hope. He knew what that looked like. He'd been that. Hopeless, desperate, watching the news swing closer with every passing second while people who should have cared turned away. And something else gnawed at him, something darker and more pragmatic. He was a wanted man now. Maybe not officially, maybe not with bounty posters nailed to every tree, but reputations traveled fast in the territories. Ernie Hale, the man who'd been accused of murder. Ernie Hale, the drifter with blood on his shadow. Towns would hear about him. Sheriffs would watch him. One wrong move, one nervous deputy, and he'd be right back where he started, swinging from rope with a crowd below screaming for his death. But a preacher? A man of faith traveling to save a desperate town? Nobody questioned a preacher. Crazy, Ernie muttered. Absolutely insane. But his hands were already moving. He stripped the black coat off the corpse, trying not to think about the wrongness of it, the violation. The preacher's clothes fit well enough. Ernie was leaner, harder, but the same basic height. The collar felt strange against his throat, like a noose made of starch and good intentions. He found the preacher's bag buried in the scattered cargo. Inside, a spare shirt, a worn Bible, letters of introduction from a seminary in Philadelphia, and $53 in clean bills. More money than Ernie had seen in months. Last, he took the preacher's identification papers. Thomas Blackwell, ordained minister, traveling west to serve the Lord's work among the frontier faithful. "Sorry, Thomas," Ernie said, finally dragging the body into the shade of a rock outcropping. He covered it with stones, not a proper burial, but better than leaving it for scavengers. "I'll try not to disgrace your name too badly." He mounted Sable and turned her nose toward the setting sun, toward Red Hollow, toward a future built on lies and desperation. The irony didn't escape him. A man who'd nearly been hanged for a murder he didn't commit was now wearing a dead man's identity and riding toward a town that thought salvation was coming. They were half right, Ernie thought grimly. Something was coming to Red Hollow. But it sure as hell wasn't salvation. The town appeared 3 days later like a mirage that refused to disappear. Red Hollow sat in a valley between two rust-colored mesas, built along a creek that probably ran strong in spring, but now barely trickled. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, lined with the usual frontier suspects: a general store, a saloon with weathered paint, a blacksmith's forge, a small hotel, and at the far end, a whitewashed church with a bell tower that leaned slightly to the left like it was tired of standing straight. But it was the silence that struck Ernie first. High noon on a weekday, and the street was almost empty. A few horses tied at hitching posts, a dog sleeping in the shade. One old man sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store with the mechanical rhythm of someone who'd given up caring whether the dirt came back tomorrow. No children playing, no women gossiping, no men arguing over cards or cattle prices, just silence, and the feeling of being watched from behind curtained windows. Ernie rode slowly, letting Sable pick her pace, keeping his face calm and open, the expression of a man who'd come to help, not to judge. The black coat and collar felt like a costume, like a lie painted on his shoulders, but he wore it the way he'd once worn a deputy's badge in Nevada, with enough confidence that people believed it belonged there. He tied Sable in front of the church and stood for a moment, taking in the building. It needed paint, needed new shingles, needed someone who cared enough to fix it. Through the half-open door he could see simple wooden pews, a plain altar, hymnals stacked crooked on a side table. "You must be Reverend Blackwell." The voice came from behind him, feminine, controlled, carrying the kind of strength that came from bending but never breaking. Ernie turned. She stood on the church steps, early 30s, dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, a blue dress that had been mended more times than replaced. Intelligent eyes studied him with an intensity that made Ernie suddenly very aware of every flaw in his disguise. This was Margaret Fairchild. Had to be. The woman who'd written the letter. "I am," Ernie said, amazed at how easily the lie came. "Miss Fairchild, I presume?" Mrs. Fairchild, she corrected gently. I'm a widow. But yes, I wrote to you. She paused, and for just a second her composure cracked. I didn't think you'd actually come. Your letter was persuasive. My letter was desperate. She descended the steps, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to make every gesture count. Up close, Ernie could see the dark circles under her eyes, the threadbare patches in her dress collar, the way her hands trembled slightly before she clasped them together. Desperation tends to make people eloquent, or foolish. Sometimes both. Then I suppose I'm equally foolish for answering. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or the ghost of humor. Most preachers I've met don't admit to foolishness so readily. I'm not most preachers. Truer than you know, he thought. No, she said softly, studying him with those sharp eyes. I don't believe you are. Before Ernie could respond, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the quiet. 6 riders came around the corner, hard men on harder horses, moving with the casual arrogance of people who'd never been told no and wouldn't accept it if they were. Margaret's face went pale. They're early. Who? Kane's men. The riders pulled up 20 feet away, blocking the street. Their leader was a big man with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, wearing a duster that had seen too much dust and a gun belt that had seen too much use. His gaze swept over Ernie with the dead-eyed assessment of a predator deciding if something was prey or threat. New preacher, Maggie? The scarred man drawled. What happened to the last one? Oh wait, he got smart and left before Kane had to encourage him. Reverend Blackwell has come to serve this community, Hayes, Margaret said, her voice level despite the fear Ernie could feel radiating from her. Just like the letter requested. Hayes grinned, showing too many teeth. Well, ain't that sweet? Another man of God come to save us from our sins. He turned his attention to Ernie, looking him up and down. You armed, Reverend? Ernie could feel the weight of his Colt under the black coat, hidden but ready. I carry faith, he said calmly. I find it's usually sufficient. The other riders laughed, cruel, mocking sounds. Faith, Hayes repeated. Well, that's real touching. But see, here's the thing, Reverend. This town belongs to Mr. Victor Kane. The land, the water, the very air people breathe. And Mr. Kane, he don't much care for outside interference, especially the religious kind. Then Mr. Kane and I should get along fine, Ernie said. I'm not here to interfere, just to serve. Serve. Hayes spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Right. Well, here's my advice, preacher man. Give your sermon on Sunday, tell folks to be good little sheep, then climb back on that sad horse and ride out before you learn what happens to people who don't understand how things work in Red Hollow. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Ernie felt his hand itch toward his gun, felt the old instincts rising. The calculation of angles and distances. Who'd draw first? Who'd die fastest? But he wasn't Ernie Hale right now. He was Reverend Thomas Blackwell. And a preacher wouldn't draw. A preacher would turn the other cheek, even if every fiber of his being screamed to do the opposite. I'll take your advice under consideration, Ernie said carefully. Now, if you gentlemen will excuse me, I have a church to prepare and a congregation to meet. He turned his back on them. The hardest thing he'd done in years, exposing his spine to 6 armed men who'd probably killed for less than the insult of being dismissed. But he didn't die. The riders laughed again, made a few more crude jokes, then wheeled their horses and thundered off down the street, leaving dust and menace in their wake. Margaret let out a breath she'd been holding. You just made a very dangerous enemy. I haven't done anything yet. You will. She looked at him with something between hope and terror. Men like Kane can smell defiance. And you, Reverend Blackwell. She paused. You don't submit easily, do you? Ernie thought about the noose, about the years of drifting, about all the times he'd been pushed and beaten and told to accept his place at the bottom of the world's boot. No, ma'am, he said quietly. I don't suppose I do. Then we're all going to die, Margaret whispered. But there was something in her eyes that looked almost like relief, as if dying while fighting was better than dying while kneeling. Ernie understood that feeling perfectly. The church's back room served as the preacher's quarters, a narrow bed, a washstand, a small desk, and a single window that looked out over the graveyard. Ernie sat on the bed, still wearing the black coat, Thomas Blackwell's Bible open on his lap. He'd been staring at it for 20 minutes, trying to make sense of the words. The pages were thin as moth wings, covered in tiny print and cryptic verses that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the meaning Ernie could extract. "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." He snorted. The meek inherited dirt and early graves. The strong inherited everything else. A knock on the door interrupted his theological crisis. "Come in," he called, closing the Bible quickly. Margaret entered carrying a tray, bread, cheese, a pot of coffee that smelled like heaven. "I thought you might be hungry. You've traveled far." "Thank you," Ernie gestured to the desk chair. "Please, sit. I'd offer better hospitality, but—" "This is Red Hollow, Reverend. We've all learned to make do with less." She poured coffee with practiced efficiency, her movements careful and precise. Ernie watched her hands, work roughened, calloused, the hands of someone who'd stopped being soft a long time ago. "Tell me about Victor Kane," he said. Margaret's hands stilled. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. If I'm going to serve this town, I need to understand what I'm dealing with." She was silent for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup like she could read the future in the dregs. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, drained of emotion. The tone of someone reciting a nightmare she'd lived through so many times it had stopped feeling real. "Kane came here 5 years ago, bought the old Templeton ranch for a fraction of its worth. Templeton had just died, and his widow needed money fast. Within 6 months, Kane had acquired 3 more properties. Then 5. Then 10. He owns half the valley now, and he's working on the other half. How? However he needs to. He offers to buy at insultingly low prices. If you refuse, your cattle disappear, your water gets poisoned, your barn catches fire. And if you still don't sell—" She met Ernie's eyes. "People have accidents, fatal ones. And the law? The law is Sheriff Thomas Barrow, who happens to be on Kane's payroll. The territorial marshal comes through twice a year, stays at Kane's ranch, and leaves without asking uncomfortable questions. We're too small to matter to anyone except ourselves. And Kane knows it." Ernie sipped his coffee, processing. "What about the men in town? Why don't they fight back?" Something dark passed across Margaret's face. "Some tried. My husband, Samuel, was one of them. He organized 12 ranchers, families who refused to sell, who thought standing together meant something. They confronted Kane at his ranch, demanded he stop the intimidation." She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Kane had them surrounded. His men opened fire. 4 people died that day, including Samuel. The rest scattered. And Kane made sure everyone knew this is what resistance costs." "I'm sorry," Ernie said, and meant it. "Sorry doesn't bring him back. Sorry doesn't return the land Kane stole from us after Samuel died. Sorry doesn't—" Her voice cracked. She set down her cup with shaking hands. "I apologize. This isn't your burden to carry." "You wrote me a letter asking for help," Ernie said gently. "That makes it my burden." Margaret looked at him, really looked, her gaze searching his face for something she desperately needed to find. "Can you really help us, Reverend? Or did I just sign your death warrant by bringing you here?" Ernie thought about his answer carefully. Thomas Blackwell would offer faith, scripture, reassurance. But Ernie Hale knew that faith without action was just pretty words painted on top of cowardice. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know this. A town that's already given up has nothing left to lose. Maybe that's the only advantage you need." It wasn't comfort, it wasn't hope, but it was honest. And somehow that seemed to mean more to Margaret than any sermon could. "Stay for Sunday service," she said, standing. "Let people see you, let them hear your voice. Maybe—" She trailed off, but Ernie understood. Maybe seeing a preacher would remind them they were still human, still worth saving, even if the preacher himself was nothing but a lie wrapped in black cloth. But word spread fast in a small town. By Saturday evening, everyone in Red Hollow knew a new preacher had arrived. Ernie spent the day walking the streets, introducing himself, shaking hands, learning names and faces, and the quiet desperation that hung over the town like fog. There was Ben Miller, who ran the general store with his wife Clara, good people worn down by years of watching their neighbors disappear or die. There was old Dutch, the blacksmith, who'd lost 3 fingers to Cain's men when he'd refused to shoe their horses for free. There was Doc Harrison, young and idealistic, who'd come west to help people and instead found himself setting bones broken by accidents and signing death certificates for natural causes that were anything but. And there were the families, the Johnsons, who'd lost their oldest son when he'd tried to stop Cain's men from driving off their cattle. The Weavers, whose daughter had disappeared one night and was found 3 days later, traumatized and silent. The Kowalskis, the Rodriguezes, the Chungs, a patchwork of immigrants and pioneers who'd come west looking for new beginnings and found only new ways to suffer. Each conversation was the same, cautious politeness hiding bone-deep fear. They wanted to hope. They wanted to believe a preacher could change something. But hope was dangerous in Red Hollow. Hope got people killed. Ernie felt the weight of their expectations like stones in his pockets. He was supposed to be their salvation, their answer to prayer. Instead, he was a fraud with a gun and a dead man's collar. That night, alone in the church, Ernie lit a lamp and sat in the front pew, staring at the simple wooden cross on the altar. He'd never been religious. His mother had taken him to Methodist services as a child, but that was before the fire, before everything turned to ash and anger. He didn't believe in divine intervention, didn't believe in miracles, didn't believe a benevolent creator would design a world this cruel and then ask people to have faith. But he did believe in justice. Not the legal kind. That was as corrupt and broken as everything else. But the raw, primal kind. The justice that came from standing up when everyone else kneeled. From protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. From making men like Cain pay for the suffering they caused. That was a religion Ernie could follow. "Talking to yourself, Reverend?" The voice came from the doorway. Ernie turned to find a man leaning against the frame, tall, lean, dressed in range clothes with a gun belt worn low and professional. He had the look of someone who'd lived hard and would die harder. "Just preparing tomorrow's sermon," Ernie said casually. "Can I help you, Mr. Cutter, Jake Cutter?" The man stepped into the lamplight, and Ernie revised his assessment. This wasn't just a hired gun. This was something more dangerous, a true believer. Someone who'd found purpose in violence and made it a calling. "I work for Mr. Cain." "I gathered." Cutter smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "Hayes said you had spine. Wanted me to come see for myself. Make sure you understood the situation before you said something stupid in front of the whole town." The situation being that Mr. Cain owns Red Hollow, and I should keep my mouth shut? "See, you're smarter than you look." Cutter circled slowly, like a wolf studying prey. "Here's how this works, Reverend. You preach nice sermons about forgiveness and turning the other cheek. You tell these people to accept their lot and trust in the Lord's plan. You do that, and you get to keep breathing. Keep that little room in back. Keep pretending you matter." He stopped directly in front of Ernie, close enough that Ernie could see the old scars on his knuckles, the calluses on his trigger finger. "But if you get ideas, if you start filling people's heads with notions about standing up or fighting back or any other foolishness, well, then you and I are going to have a different kind of conversation. The kind that ends with you in that graveyard out back. Understand?" Ernie stood slowly, meeting Cutter's eyes. They were the same height, the same build. 2 men who'd learned violence early and carried it like a second skin. "I understand perfectly," Ernie said. "You're scared." Cutter's smile vanished. "What?" "You're scared. Cain's scared. That's why you're here, threatening a preacher. Because you know what I know. This whole thing runs on fear, and if people stop being afraid—" Ernie leaned in slightly. "Then men like you become obsolete." For 3 heartbeats, Ernie thought Cutter would draw. He could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the slight shift of his weight. This was a man who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation. But Cutter didn't draw. Instead, he laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "You got a death wish, preacher man?" "Not particularly, but I stopped being afraid of dying a long time ago. That makes me very difficult to threaten." Cutter studied him with new interest, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected. "You're not like other preachers." "No," Ernie agreed. "I'm not." "Good. Maybe you'll last longer than the last one." Cutter headed for the door, then paused. "Fair warning, Reverend. I don't like killing preachers, bad for the soul, or so I'm told. But I will if you make me. Cain pays too well for moral complications. He left, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Ernie sat back down, his heart pounding harder than he wanted to admit. That had been close, closer than he'd allowed himself to acknowledge. One wrong word, one moment of bravado too far, and Cutter would have drawn. And then what? Ernie would have had to shoot back. His cover would be blown. The whole elaborate lie would collapse. He looked down at his hands. They were steady. Always had been, even when death came calling. But steadiness wouldn't be enough in Red Hollow. He needed something else. Something that could turn fear into hope without getting everyone killed in the process. He needed a miracle. And since he didn't believe in those, he'd have to manufacture one himself. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold. Frost painted the windows silver. The church bell rang at 9 o'clock. Not the triumphant peal of celebration, but a slow, mournful clang that sounded like a funeral dirge. They came slowly, hesitantly, like prisoners walking to execution. Families filled the pews in careful silence, mothers clutching children, men with their hats in their hands, everyone avoiding eye contact. Margaret sat in the front row, her face composed, but her hands gripping her hymnal tight enough to whiten her knuckles. Ernie stood at the altar, wearing the black coat and collar, Thomas Blackwell's Bible open to a random page he hadn't actually read. His mouth was dry. His pulse hammered in his ears. He'd faced down gunfighters and outlaws, and once, memorably, a grizzly bear in Montana. But standing in front of these desperate, broken people, expected to offer them salvation through words he didn't believe. This was the hardest thing he'd ever done. "Let us pray," he began, because that's what preachers did. Heads bowed. The silence stretched. Ernie closed his eyes, searching for words, any words, that wouldn't sound like the hollow platitudes he'd heard in every church he'd ever been forced to attend. Blessed are the meek. No, that was a lie. The meek inherited nothing but dust. Turn the other cheek. Another lie. The only thing turning the other cheek accomplished was getting hit twice. What could he possibly say to these people that wouldn't insult their intelligence or mock their suffering? The truth, he realized. The only truth he knew. "I'm not going to lie to you," Ernie said, opening his eyes. "I don't have easy answers. I don't have comforting scripture that'll make the pain go away. I can't promise that faith alone will save you from men who've built their power on your fear." Confused murmurs rippled through the congregation. This wasn't how sermons started. "What I can tell you is this. Every person in this room has a choice. You can keep your heads down, keep hoping someone else will solve your problems, keep pretending that if you're quiet enough and small enough, evil will pass you by." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Or you can decide you've had enough, not with violence, not yet, anyway, but with simple, stubborn defiance, with refusing to accept that this is how things have to be." Margaret was staring at him, her eyes wide with something between shock and recognition. "There's a widow among you," Ernie continued, his voice gaining strength. "Her name is Sarah Mitchell. Her husband was murdered 6 months ago because he wouldn't sell his land to Victor Cain, and now Cain's men are coming to drive her and her children off that land. It's happening tomorrow, at dawn." Shocked silence. Several people glanced at Sarah Mitchell, a thin woman in her 40s sitting with 3 children who looked like they'd forgotten how to smile. "Tomorrow," Ernie repeated. "They're going to take everything she has left, and you're all going to watch it happen, just like you've watched it happen before. Because that's how it works in Red Hollow, isn't it? Cain takes. You surrender. The cycle continues." "What choice do we have?" someone called out, Ben Miller from the general store. "We're farmers and shopkeepers. Cain has an army." "You have the choice to say no," Ernie said simply. "Just that. Just no. And then we die," Old Dutch rasped, "like Samuel Fairchild died, like the others died." "Maybe," Ernie admitted. "Or maybe you discover that fear is Cain's only real weapon, and once you stop feeding it, he becomes just another man. Mortal, beatable, human." He stepped down from the altar, walking among the pews, looking people in the eyes. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to ride out to the Mitchell property. I'm going to stand between Sarah and her children and whatever Cain sends. I'm going to tell them no, she's not leaving, they're not taking her land, and this ends here." They'll kill you, Margaret whispered. Probably, Ernie agreed. But here's the thing. I'm not asking you to fight. I'm not asking you to die. I'm asking you to witness, to stand there and watch what happens when one person refuses to kneel. Because maybe, just maybe, that's how change starts. Not with armies or gunfights, but with one stubborn fool who decides enough is enough. He returned to the altar, his sermon finished. That's all I have for you today. No hymns, no benediction, just a time and a place where something is going to change, one way or another. You're welcome to attend. Or not. The choice, for once, is actually yours. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, slowly, Sarah Mitchell stood. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice was steady. Thank you, Reverend. One by one, others rose. Not everyone. Fear still had plenty of grip on Red Hollow. But enough. Margaret, Ben Miller, Doc Harrison, a dozen others. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even hope yet. But it was a start. And sometimes, Ernie thought, as he watched them file out, a start was all you got. What you did with it determined everything else. The rest of Sunday passed in tense preparation. Ernie returned to his room and did something he hadn't done since taking Thomas Blackwell's identity. He cleaned his gun. The Colt Peacemaker gleamed in the lamplight. Well-maintained, perfectly balanced, a tool built for one purpose and that purpose alone. He knew what he was risking. Knew that the moment he drew this gun, the preacher disguise would collapse. These people would learn that their salvation had arrived in the form of a drifter who'd stolen a dead man's collar. But he also knew that faith without backbone was just cowardice in religious clothing. If he stood out there tomorrow unarmed, spouting scripture, Cain's men would gun him down like a dog, and the message would be clear. Even your preacher can't save you. Better to be a violent truth than a peaceful lie. A knock interrupted his thoughts. It's open. Margaret entered, carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She set it on the desk without ceremony, then met his eyes. You're going to need this. Ernie unwrapped the bundle. Inside, a rifle. Winchester 73, well-maintained, ammunition included. He looked up at her in surprise. This was Samuel's, Margaret said quietly. He was a good shot. Not as good as he thought, but good enough for what matters. I can't. Yes, you can. Because you're not really a preacher, are you, Reverend Blackwell? The words hung between them like a drawn blade. Ernie's hand drifted toward his pistol on instinct, but Margaret didn't flinch. She just watched him with those intelligent eyes, waiting. What makes you say that? He asked carefully. The way you move. The way you assessed Cutter like you were calculating who'd win a fight. The calluses on your hands, those aren't from turning Bible pages, Reverend. Those are from pulling a trigger. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. I don't care who you really are. I don't care what you've done or where you came from. All I care about is this. Are you capable of helping us? Not with sermons, not with faith. With action? Ernie made a decision, a dangerous one, but necessary. I was accused of murder, he said, the truth tasting bitter. Almost hanged for a crime I didn't commit. The real killer confessed at the last second, but the town still ran me out. I took Reverend Blackwell's identity because I needed to disappear, and Red Hollow seemed like a good place to hide. He expected horror, judgment, betrayal. Instead, Margaret smiled, a small, fierce expression. Then you understand what it's like to be powerless, to face death for something beyond your control, to watch people who should protect you turn away instead. Yes, Ernie said, I understand that perfectly. Good, because that's everyone in this town. We're all facing death, Reverend. The only question is whether we face it fighting or kneeling. She touched the rifle. Samuel believed in fighting. It got him killed, but at least he died standing up. I can't promise I won't get more people killed, Ernie warned. This could go very wrong, very fast. We're already dying, Margaret said. Just slower, less dramatic. If you can give us a chance to die on our feet instead of our knees. She met his eyes. That's all anyone can ask for. After she left, Ernie sat with the rifle across his lap, thinking about tomorrow, about Sarah Mitchell and her children, about Cain and his hired killers, about all the ways this could end in blood and failure. But mostly he thought about Margaret's words. We're already dying. That was the secret nobody wanted to acknowledge. Red Hollow was already dead. Cain had killed it slowly, piece by piece, soul by soul. What walked through these streets wasn't a living town. It was a corpse that hadn't stopped moving yet, but corpses couldn't fight back, couldn't feel pain, couldn't hope. Living things could. Maybe that's all he could really offer Red Hollow, a chance to remember what being alive felt like, even if only for a moment. Even if that moment ended in violence and graves. It wasn't salvation, but it was something. And in a place as broken as Red Hollow, sometimes something was the closest you got to grace. Dawn came cold and clear, painting the eastern sky in shades of blood and copper. Ernie rode out toward the Mitchell property with Margaret beside him. She'd insisted on coming, and he'd learned not to argue with women who'd already buried their courage alongside their husbands. The Mitchell farm sat 2 miles outside town, a modest spread with a small house, a barn that needed repairs, and fields that had gone mostly untended since William Mitchell's death. Sarah stood on the porch with her 3 children clustered behind her. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12, the youngest still in diapers. "Thank you for coming, Reverend," Sarah said, though her eyes were on the horizon, watching for Cain's men. "Where else would I be?" They didn't have to wait long. Just after sunrise, riders appeared, 6 of them, led by Hayes with his scar and his sneer. They pulled up 50 yards from the house, spreading out in a loose line. "Morning, Sarah," Hayes called cheerfully. "Come to help you pack. Mr. Cain's being generous. He'll give you until noon to clear out. After that, anything left becomes his property." "I'm not leaving," Sarah said, her voice shaking but steady. "This is my land. My husband died for it." "Your husband died because he was stupid," Hayes corrected. "Don't make the same mistake. You got kids to think about." That's when Ernie stepped forward, moving past Sarah to stand at the edge of the porch. "Mrs. Mitchell isn't going anywhere," he said calmly. "You can ride back and tell Mr. Cain that this particular piece of land is no longer available for acquisition." Hayes stared at him, then laughed. "Seriously, preacher? You're going to stop us? You and what army?" "Just me." The words fell into the morning air like stones into still water. Hayes' smile faded. "You're making a real bad mistake." "I've made worse." The riders shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward weapons. This was the moment, the razor's edge between words and violence. One wrong move, one nervous trigger pull, and people would die. Ernie felt the old calm settling over him, the clarity that came from accepting death as a possible outcome. His hand rested near his coat where the Colt waited. "Last chance, preacher," Hayes warned. "Right away. Live to preach another day." "Can't do that." "Why the hell not?" "Because I've been running my whole life," Ernie thought. "Because I've watched good people suffer while I looked away. Because I'm tired of being a coward wrapped in survivor's guilt." "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. Hayes sighed, like a man tired of an unpleasant chore. "Well, don't say I didn't warn you." His hand dropped toward his gun, and froze when he saw the riders coming up the road. 20 people, maybe more. Walking, riding, coming from town in a slow but steady stream. Margaret had been busy last night, Ernie realized. She'd gathered everyone who'd stood in church, everyone who'd decided that watching mattered. Ben Miller, Doc Harrison, Old Dutch on his limping mare, the Johnsons, the Weavers, the Kowalskis, all the broken families who'd lost pieces of themselves to Cain's greed. They weren't armed. Well, a few had hunting rifles, but nothing that would match Cain's professionals in a real fight. But they were there, witnesses. A line drawn in the dust that said, "If you kill the preacher, you kill him in front of all of us." Hayes looked at them, his confidence cracking slightly. "What the hell is this?" "This is people remembering they have spines," Ernie said. "You can still shoot me. Probably kill a few others too. But then what? You've murdered a preacher and a dozen townspeople in cold blood. You think the territorial governor will ignore that? The newspapers in Cheyenne?" He could see Hayes calculating, realizing the trap. Cain's power worked because his violence was selective, a murder here, an accident there, small enough to slip under official notice. But a massacre? That would bring attention Cain couldn't afford. "You think this changes anything?" Hayes snarled. "Cain owns this valley, owns you. He'll just wait until you're alone, preacher, catch you on a dark road. Make it look like bandits. Maybe, Ernie agreed. But today, right now, Mrs. Mitchell keeps her land. That's enough. For a long moment, the two groups faced each other, Kane's hired killers against Red Hollow's desperate citizens. Violence trembled in the air like heat lightning. Then Hayes spat in the dust and wheeled his horse around. "This ain't over," he promised. "Not even close." They rode off, leaving dust and unspoken threats behind. The townspeople erupted in something between cheers and sobs, the sound of people who'd forgotten what victory tasted like, even a small one. Sarah Mitchell collapsed to her knees, crying. Her children clung to her. Margaret stood beside Ernie, her expression unreadable. "You bought us time," she said quietly. "Maybe a week, maybe less." "I know. Kane will come for you. Not Hayes, someone worse, someone who doesn't care about witnesses or newspapers." "I know that too." She looked at him, really looked, seeing past the collar and the lie to whatever broken thing underneath had decided to make a stand. "Was it worth it?" she asked. "Risking your life for people you barely know?" Ernie thought about the noose, about all the towns that had turned him away, about the years of drifting through a world that had no place for men like him. "Ask me again," he said, "when we see how this story ends." Because that was the truth he'd learned on the frontier. Nothing was worth it or meaningless in isolation. Value came from what you did with the time you bought, the space you created. Whether this morning meant something would depend on what Red Hollow did with it, whether they remembered they could fight, or forgot again and went back to dying quietly. The victory at the Mitchell farm lasted exactly 3 days before Victor Kane reminded Red Hollow who really held the reins. On Wednesday afternoon, the general store burned. Ernie was in the church when he saw the smoke. Thick black columns rising against the pale sky like accusatory fingers. He ran toward Main Street with half the town, arriving to find Ben Miller's store engulfed in flames that roared and crackled with unnatural intensity. The heat pushed back the crowd, turning faces red and sending embers spinning into the air like malevolent fireflies. Ben stood 50 feet away, held back by his wife Clara, watching 30 years of work reduced to ash and memory. His face was blank, shock having stripped away everything except the mechanical act of breathing. "Coal oil," Old Dutch muttered, standing beside Ernie. "You can smell it. This wasn't no accident." The volunteer fire brigade did what they could, but the building was lost before they'd even formed a bucket line. By sunset, all that remained was a blackened skeleton of timber and the acrid stench of destruction. Sheriff Barrow showed up an hour after the fire started, a heavy man in his 50s who'd learned to look the other way so often he'd forgotten how to see straight ahead. He walked the perimeter with exaggerated concern, making notes in a little book that would never become an official report. "Terrible tragedy," he announced to the gathered crowd. "Looks like a lamp got knocked over. These old buildings, you know, dry timber, one spark, and whoosh." "That's a lie," Ernie said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Barrow's face darkened. "You calling me a liar, Reverend?" "I'm calling this arson. Everyone here knows it. The only question is whether you're incompetent or complicit." The crowd held its collective breath. "You didn't challenge the sheriff in public, even a corrupt one. It wasn't done. It wasn't safe." Barrow stepped close, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You're new here, preacher man, so let me educate you on how things work. Accidents happen, buildings burn, people get hurt when they don't mind their business. You understand what I'm saying?" "Perfectly," Ernie said. "You're threatening me. You're admitting Kane ordered this, and you're too stupid to realize you just did it in front of 40 witnesses." Barrow's hand moved toward his gun. "Touch that weapon, and I'll put you down like a rabid dog." The voice came from behind Ernie. He turned to find Jake Cutter standing at the edge of the crowd, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, watching the scene with detached amusement. "This is official business, Cutter," Barrow blustered. "You got no authority." "I got Mr. Kane's authority, which trumps that tin star you bought for $20 and a promise to look the other way." Cutter's gaze shifted to Ernie. "Mr. Kane wants to see you, Reverend, tonight, at his ranch. He says it's time you two had a proper conversation." "And if I decline the invitation?" Cutter smiled. "Then tomorrow something else burns. Maybe the church. Maybe Doc Harrison's house with him inside it. Maybe the schoolhouse with all those children. Mr. Kane ain't particular, long as his point gets made." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Ernie felt the weight of eyes on him, the whole town watching, waiting to see if their preacher would fold or stand. "What time?" Ernie asked. "Sundown. Come alone. Come unarmed. Come ready to listen." Cutter tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Ernie standing in the ruins of Ben Miller's life, surrounded by people who just learned that defiance carried a price they'd all have to pay. Margaret found him an hour later, sitting on the church steps and staring at nothing. "You're going," she said. "Not a question." "Don't have much choice." "There's always a choice. You could refuse. Let them burn the rest of the town. At least you'd still be alive." "Would I?" Ernie looked at her. "What kind of life is that, watching people suffer because I was too scared to face the man responsible?" "A long one, potentially." Despite everything, Ernie almost laughed. "You make cowardice sound appealing when you put it like that." Margaret sat beside him, her shoulder barely touching his, a small contact that somehow felt more intimate than a dozen embraces. "Cain will try to buy you. That's his first move. He'll offer money, position, safety. When that doesn't work, he'll threaten. When that doesn't work," she trailed off. "When that doesn't work, he kills me. I know. I've met men like Cain before, different names, same playbook." "Then why go?" Ernie thought about that. Why was he doing this? For these people he barely knew? For some abstract notion of justice that the frontier had long since abandoned? Or was it something more selfish, a need to prove to himself that he was more than the sum of his failures, more than a drifter who'd spent his life running from ropes and responsibilities? "Because someone has to," he said finally, "and I'm the fool who volunteered." "You're not a fool, Ernie Hale." The use of his real name jolted him. He'd almost forgotten it existed beneath the preacher's collar. "You know my name," he said quietly. "I asked around. Sent a telegram to a friend in Cheyenne who knows people. Took some digging, but," she shrugged, "I wanted to know who was really standing between us and Cain. And now that you know I'm a fraud, a wanted man pretending to be holy, now I know you're someone who understands what it means to face injustice. Someone who could have kept running but chose to stop." She met his eyes. "That's more than enough, Ernie, more than we had any right to hope for." The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. Ernie stood, checking his weapons one last time, the Colt at his hip, a knife in his boot, and the small derringer he'd strapped to his forearm as insurance against Cain's promise of coming unarmed. "If I don't come back," he began. "You'll come back," Margaret interrupted fiercely. "You're too stubborn to die before you finish what you started." Ernie wanted to believe that, wanted to trust in his own survival instincts and skill. But the frontier had taught him that wanting and getting were two different countries separated by an ocean of chance. "Take care of them," he said, meaning the town, meaning everyone who'd stood at the Mitchell farm and remembered what courage looked like. "Take care of yourself," Margaret countered. "They need you more than they need me." She kissed him then, quick and fierce, a declaration of something neither of them had time to name. Then she was gone, disappearing into the gathering dusk, leaving Ernie alone with his weapons and his doubts. He rode out as the last light bled from the sky, heading toward Victor Cain's ranch and whatever waited there in the darkness. The Cain spread sat in the prime valley land, 15,000 acres of the best grazing in Wyoming territory. The house rose 3 stories, built from imported timber and stone, with gas lamps glowing in every window like a fortress, announcing its wealth to the surrounding darkness. 2 armed guards stopped Ernie at the main gate. "Weapons," the larger one demanded. Ernie handed over his Colt and the Winchester, keeping his face neutral. The guards didn't search him thoroughly. Arrogance or incompetence, he wasn't sure which. The derringer stayed hidden against his forearm, a small comfort against what was coming. They escorted him to the main house, through a grand entrance hall decorated with oil paintings and imported furniture that screamed money without taste. More guards lined the walls, 6, 7, 8 that Ernie could see. Probably more he couldn't. Cain wasn't taking chances. The study was on the 2nd floor, paneled in dark wood with a massive desk that could have doubled as a fortress wall. Behind it sat Victor Cain. He was smaller than Ernie expected, barely 5'8", with a slim build that suggested he'd never done real physical work in his life. But his eyes were intelligent, calculating, the eyes of a man who'd learned to win through strategy rather than strength. He wore an expensive suit, his graying hair pomaded back, a gold watch chain glinting at his vest. "Reverend Blackwell," Kane said, his voice surprisingly cultured. "Or should I call you Ernie Hale? I haven't decided which name suits you better." So he knew. Of course he knew. Men like Kane always did their research. "Call me whatever you want," Ernie said. "Doesn't change why I'm here." "And why is that? Because I invited you? Or because you're curious to meet the devil you've been preaching against?" "I don't preach against devils. I preach against men who hide behind fear and call it power." Kane smiled, genuinely amused. "Sit, please. Would you like a drink? I have excellent whiskey, imported from Scotland, aged 20 years. Far better than the rotgut they serve in town." "I'll stand." "Suit yourself." Kane poured himself 2 fingers of amber liquid, sipped it appreciatively. "I've been watching you, Mr. Hale. You're an interesting contradiction. A gunfighter pretending to be a preacher. A wanted man playing savior. A drifter who decided to stop drifting at the absolute worst possible place. Red Hollow needed someone. Red Hollow needed to learn acceptance. I was teaching them that lesson quite effectively until you arrived and filled their heads with dangerous ideas. Ideas like standing up for themselves, like refusing to be victims. Ideas like false hope," Kane corrected sharply. "Hope is cruel when it promises things it can't deliver. You can't protect them, Mr. Hale. You're one man with one gun against an empire I've spent 5 years building. The only variable is how many people die before you accept reality." Ernie moved closer to the desk, his hands loose and ready. "Here's what I accept. You're a coward who hides behind hired killers because you're too weak to face opposition yourself. You're not an empire. You're a house of cards held together by threats and murder, and houses of cards collapse real easy once someone stops being afraid to blow." Kane's expression hardened. "The store was a warning. The next fire won't be property. It'll be people. Children, if necessary. I'm not sentimental about collateral damage." "Then you're not as smart as you think. Burning stores creates fear. Burning children creates martyrs, creates witnesses, creates exactly the kind of attention men like you can't afford." "Men like me?" Kane stood, circling the desk slowly. "Let me tell you about men like me, Mr. Hale. We're the ones who build civilization out of wilderness, who turn chaos into order, who make the hard decisions so that weak people can sleep safely in their beds. I came to this valley when it was nothing, squatters fighting over scraps, no law, no structure, no future. I created all of this. I brought order. You brought tyranny. Same thing, to people too stupid to appreciate the difference." Kane stopped 5 feet away. "I'm going to make you an offer. $5,000 and safe passage to California. New identity, fresh start. My personal guarantee that no one will follow you. All you have to do is leave. Ride out tomorrow morning, never come back, and let Red Hollow return to the natural order." "Natural order," Ernie repeated. "That's what you call stealing land and murdering anyone who resists?" "I call it efficiency. The weak yield to the strong. Always have, always will. I'm simply honest about it. And if I refuse your offer," Kane's smile turned cold, "then you'll die. Not tonight. I'm not crude enough to kill a guest in my own home. But soon. Maybe Cutter will face you in the street, make it look honorable. Maybe you'll have an accident on a dark road. Or maybe—" He paused for effect. "Maybe I'll burn that church with you inside it, then hang the crime on some drifter passing through. Either way, you'll be gone, and Red Hollow will remember the price of defiance." Ernie had been in enough tight situations to recognize when violence was inevitable. This was that moment, the point where words stopped mattering and all that remained was who drew faster, who aimed truer, who wanted survival more. His hand moved toward the derringer strapped to his forearm. Kane's hand moved toward a desk drawer. They both froze when Jake Cutter stepped through the door, holding Ernie's confiscated Colt. Now, gentlemen," Cutter said mildly. "Let's not turn Mr. Kane's study into an abattoir. The rugs are imported Persian, bloodstains something terrible." Ernie's eyes flicked between Kane and Cutter, calculating odds. 2 targets. 1 hidden weapon with 2 shots. Guards in the hallway. Survival probability hovering somewhere near 0. But Cutter didn't aim the Colt at Ernie. Instead, he set it on a side table and leaned against the doorframe, his posture casual but his eyes sharp. "You made your offer, Mr. Kane." He refused, Killing him now just proves his point about you being a coward who can't face opposition. Kane's jaw tightened. Your advice is noted, Mr. Cutter, but I pay you to eliminate problems, not lecture me on tactics. You pay me to keep you alive and powerful, Cutter corrected. Right now, killing this preacher creates more problems than it solves. The whole town knows he came here. He doesn't return, you'll have a martyr and a murder investigation. Better to let him walk out. Let people see he's just a man who can be intimidated. Undermines his whole image. The logic was sound, and Kane knew it. The tension in the room shifted, violence postponing itself for another day. You have until Sunday, Kane said to Ernie, his voice tight with controlled fury. Preach your sermon. Say whatever you want. Then you leave Red Hollow forever, or I'll demonstrate exactly how little one man's courage matters against systematic cruelty. Ernie retrieved his Colt from the table, holstered it slowly. Sunday it is. Cutter escorted him out through the grand hallway and past the guards who watched with barely concealed disappointment. They'd been hoping for violence, for entertainment, for something to break the monotony of standing watch in a rich man's fortress. At the front gate, Cutter handed over the Winchester. You should take Kane's offer, he said quietly. 5,000, and your life is a good deal, all things considered. Why do you care whether I live or die? Cutter studied him in the lamplight, something almost like respect flickering across his face. Because you remind me of someone, a younger me, maybe, back when I still thought there were things worth dying for besides money. He paused. That man got himself killed in a gunfight in Texas over a woman who didn't even remember his name a year later. Courage is admirable, Hale, but it's also stupid. And stupid men don't survive the frontier. Neither do cowards, Ernie said. No, but smart men do. Smart men take the money and run. Cutter stepped back. I'll see you Sunday, Reverend, one way or another. Ernie rode back to Red Hollow under a sky full of stars that looked like scattered diamonds on black velvet. The night was cold enough to see his breath, to feel winter pressing in from the mountains. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, lonesome and hungry, calling for a pack that might not answer. He knew what Sunday meant now. It was Kane's deadline, his ultimatum delivered with a veneer of civility. Preach your sermon and leave, or we escalate from burned stores to burned bodies. The smart move was to take the money. Cutter was right about that. $5,000 could buy a new life somewhere far from Wyoming territory, far from men who remembered Ernie Hale's face or reputation. California, maybe. Oregon. Someplace where the past couldn't follow and the future looked like something other than a noose or a bullet. But smart and right weren't always the same direction. He found Margaret waiting on the church steps, wrapped in a shawl against the cold. She stood when she saw him, relief and fear warring across her face. You're alive, she said. Surprised? Terrified, I thought. She stopped, composing herself. What did Kane say? Ernie told her everything, the offer, the threats, the Sunday deadline. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face growing harder with each detail. You should take the money, she said when he finished. You sound like Cutter. Cutter's smart. $5,000 is more than anyone in Red Hollow will see in 10 years. You could disappear, be safe, be free, and you'd all go back to being slaves in everything but name. We were slaves before you came. We'll be slaves after you leave. The only difference is whether you're alive to feel guilty about it. Ernie sat beside her on the steps, the cold stone leaching warmth through his clothes. Is that what you really want? For me to run? Margaret was silent for a long time, staring at the dark street where shadows pooled like spilled ink. I want you to live, she said finally. Samuel tried to fight Kane, and it got him killed. Got 4 other men killed. Accomplished nothing except widows and orphans and graves. I don't want that for you. I don't want to bury another man. She stopped. Another man you what? Another man I care about, she finished quietly. Is that so hard to believe? That maybe in the middle of all this darkness, I found someone who makes me remember what hope feels like? Ernie reached for her hand, found it cold and trembling. I care about you too, Margaret, which is why I can't run. Because if I leave, Kane wins. And when men like Kane win, they never stop taking. Today it's land. Tomorrow it's lives. Eventually it'll be you, your school, your students. There's no endgame where you survive if I don't stop him now. You're one man. I know, but I'm the one man who showed up. That has to count for something. They sat together in the cold, holding hands like teenagers at a church social, drawing comfort from contact while the world pressed in from all sides. Above them, the crooked church steeple reached toward stars that didn't care about human struggles or frontier justice, or any of the small, desperate acts that defined life at civilization's edge. What happened Sunday? Margaret asked. I don't know. Cain expects me to preach and run, but if I run, everything we've started collapses. Everyone who stood at the Mitchell farm goes back to being afraid. The cycle continues. And if you don't run, then Cain escalates. People die. Maybe me. Maybe others. Maybe everyone. Not much of a choice. No, Ernie agreed, but it's the only one I've got. Margaret leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. Whatever you decide, Ernie Hale, don't do it alone. This town may be broken, but we're not dead yet. And broken things can still cut. It was the closest thing to hope Ernie had heard in days. The next 3 days passed like a storm building on the horizon. Everyone could see it coming, but no one knew exactly when or how hard it would hit. Thursday morning, Doc Harrison found a dead horse on his porch. Throat cut, the word next carved into its hide. The message was clear: cooperate or you're next on the list. Thursday afternoon, 2 of Cain's men rode through town, making a show of their weapons and their authority. They stopped at the hotel, the saloon, the feed store, reminding everyone who held the real power in Red Hollow. Friday brought a different kind of pressure. A delegation of townspeople came to the church, led by Ben Miller, whose store was still smoldering in everyone's memory. Reverend, Ben began, hat in hand and shame on his face, we need to talk. Ernie knew what was coming before the words left Ben's mouth. He'd seen this play before, in a dozen different towns with a dozen different variations. Fear, when it got strong enough, always sounded the same. Go ahead, Ernie said. We appreciate what you tried to do. Standing up to Cain, helping Sarah Mitchell, giving us hope. But Ben swallowed hard. We can't win this. Cain's too powerful, too ruthless. If you stay, more people will die. Good people. Innocent people. And if I leave, then maybe things go back to normal. Maybe Cain stops punishing us. Maybe we can survive. Ernie looked at the other faces, men and women he'd come to know over the past 2 weeks. Some met his eyes with apologetic guilt. Others stared at the ground, unable to face what they were asking. You want me to run, Ernie said. You want me to take Cain's money and disappear. We want you to live, Clara Miller said softly, and we want our town to survive, even if survival means living under Cain's thumb. That's not living. That's just dying slower. Maybe, Ben admitted, but it's better than dying fast. Better than watching our children burn because we got uppity ideas about standing up. The worst part was understanding their logic. These were practical people who'd learned brutal lessons about the cost of resistance. They weren't cowards. They were pragmatists who'd done the math and realized that one preacher with a gun couldn't outfight an empire. I'll think about it, Ernie said, which was the kindest lie he could offer. They left quietly, carrying their shame like heavy loads. Only Margaret stayed behind, her face unreadable. Are you angry at them? She asked. No, scared people make scared choices. Can't fault them for that. But you're not leaving. No. Why? If the people you're trying to save are telling you to go, why stay? Ernie thought about the noose again, about standing on those gallows while a crowd screamed for his death, about the moment the real killer confessed and everything changed, except it hadn't really changed at all, because fear and prejudice had already convicted him in their hearts. Because someone has to prove that fear doesn't always win, he said, even if that someone dies proving it, especially then. Margaret stepped close, her hands framing his face. You're going to get yourself killed, Ernie Hale. Probably. And you think your death will mean something? That it'll inspire these people to finally fight back? I think maybe it'll plant a seed. Maybe not in this generation, but the next. Or the one after that. Sometimes that's all you can hope for, to leave the world a little less dark than you found it. She kissed him then, longer and deeper than before. A kiss that tasted like goodbye and desperation and all the futures they'd never have together. "I hate that you're noble," she whispered against his lips. "I hate that you're right, and I hate that I'm going to lose you right after finding you." "You haven't lost me yet. Sunday's coming, Ernie, and when it does, everything changes." She was right, of course. Sunday was the fulcrum point, the moment when all the building pressure would either dissipate or explode. Saturday night, Ernie sat in his small room, cleaning weapons and preparing for possibilities. The Colt, the Winchester, the Derringer. A knife he'd sharpened until it could split hairs. He wasn't sure which, if any, would make a difference when Kane's full force descended, but being prepared felt better than being helpless. A knock interrupted his preparations. "It's open." Jake Cutter stepped inside, unarmed except for the gun belt he always wore. In the lamplight, he looked older than Ernie had first thought. Late 40s, maybe, with lines around his eyes that spoke of violence witnessed and perpetrated. "Come to kill me early?" Ernie asked, not reaching for a weapon. If Cutter wanted him dead, he'd already be dead. "Come to talk. Man to man. No Kane involved." Ernie gestured to the room's only chair. Cutter sat, his movements economical and practiced. "I lied earlier," Cutter said. "About that young man in Texas. He wasn't someone I knew. He was me, and the woman he died for wasn't worth remembering, but the lesson was." "What lesson?" "That courage without strategy is just suicide with better publicity." Cutter leaned forward. "I've been watching you, Hale. You're good. Better than good. I've seen you move, seen how you assess situations. In a straight fight, you might even take me. Might. This a challenge?" "This is an offer. Different from Kane's. He wants you gone. I want you alive and working for me." Ernie blinked. "Working for you?" "I'm planning my exit from Kane's employment. Man like him, he's going to overreach eventually, and I don't intend to be there when he does. I've been saving money, making plans. Montana Territory, maybe, or Idaho. Somewhere I can buy land, live quiet, die old." "And you want a partner?" "I want someone I can trust to watch my back when I make my move. Someone skilled enough to matter in a fight, smart enough to know when not to fight." Cutter met his eyes. "You're wasted on this town, Hale. These people don't deserve what you're offering. They're already asking you to leave, already choosing survival over dignity. Why die for people who won't even mourn you properly?" It was a seductive offer, Ernie had to admit. A future that didn't end in blood and graves. A partnership built on mutual skill and respect. A chance to ride away from Red Hollow and all its impossible problems. "What about Margaret?" Ernie asked. Cutter shrugged. "Bring her if you want. 3's harder to hide than 2, but it's manageable. Kane doesn't care about her specifically, just about maintaining control." "And the rest of the town?" "Learns to live with Kane, or doesn't. Either way, not your problem anymore." Ernie stood, moving to the window. Outside, Red Hollow slept fitfully under a quarter moon, utterly unaware that its fate was being negotiated in a preacher's room by 2 men who'd never planned on being anyone's salvation. "No," Ernie said. "No? I appreciate the offer, truly, but I can't run. Not from this. Not now." Cutter sighed, standing slowly. "Then you're a fool, and you'll die a fool's death. Kane won't face you honorably. He'll ambush you, or poison you, or burn the church while you sleep. And no one will remember your name a year from now. Maybe, but I'll know I didn't run. That has to be enough." "Enough for who?" "You'll be dead. Enough for the man I want to be, even if I only get to be him for a few more days." Cutter studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I understand. Respect it, even. But respect doesn't stop bullets, Hale. Remember that tomorrow when Kane's men come." He left without another word, leaving Ernie alone with his weapons and his choices. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, frost painting patterns on the church windows like nature's last benediction. Ernie dressed carefully, the black coat, the white collar, the gun belt hidden beneath because he'd long since stopped pretending he was just a preacher. The church bell rang at 9, its tone somehow more somber than usual, like it knew what was coming. They filled the pews slowly, Margaret in front, the Millers toward the back, Old Dutch and Doc Harrison on the sides. More came than Ernie expected. Curiosity or solidarity, or maybe just morbid fascination with watching a man deliver what might be his final sermon. Kane's men stood outside, visible through the windows. 6 of them, including Hayes, making their presence known, making their threat clear. Ernie stepped to the altar, Thomas Blackwell's Bible in his hands. He opened it to a random page, not bothering to read the words there. Whatever truth this moment required wouldn't come from ancient scripture. "I had a sermon prepared," he began. "Something about faith and perseverance, about how the righteous will inherit the earth and the wicked will face judgment." He closed the Bible with a soft thump. "But that would be a lie, and you've all had enough lies from men standing at this altar." Confused murmurs rippled through the congregation. "Truth is, I don't know if the righteous inherit anything except early graves. I don't know if the wicked face judgment or just die rich and comfortable in their beds. The frontier doesn't operate on divine justice. It operates on who's willing to take and who's willing to submit." He stepped down from the altar, walking among the pews like he had 2 weeks ago. "Victor Kane owns this valley. That's a fact. He's built his empire through fear and violence, and the calculation that people will always choose survival over dignity. And he's been right, hasn't he? Every time he's pushed, you've yielded. Every time he's taken, you've let him. Because the alternative, fighting back, standing firm, risking everything, seemed too terrible to contemplate." "What choice did we have?" someone called out, a voice Ernie didn't recognize. "The same choice everyone has: kneel or stand, die slow or die fast. Except that men like Kane define reality, or fight to define it yourself." He paused in front of Margaret's pew. "Kane gave me an ultimatum. Leave today or face escalation. Take his money and run, or watch people I care about burn. And you know what? He's probably right. If I stay, people will die. Maybe me, maybe others, maybe all of us." He could feel the congregation holding its breath, waiting for the conclusion they all expected. The preacher admitting defeat, accepting reality, riding away to save himself and them. "So here's what I'm going to do," Ernie said, his voice gaining strength. "I'm staying, and I'm inviting anyone who's tired of living on their knees to stand with me. Not to start a war, we'd lose, but to draw a line. To tell Kane that some things aren't for sale and some people can't be intimidated into silence." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Sarah Mitchell stood, her children beside her. Then Margaret. Then Old Dutch, his missing fingers and all. Then Ben Miller, despite his burned store and his very legitimate fear. One by one they rose. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to be a statement. Enough to make Kane's threat of escalation real. Outside, Hayes and his men watched through the windows. Ernie could see the calculation happening. Report this to Kane, watch the fireworks begin. "You've all made your choice," Ernie said quietly. "There's no going back from here. Kane will respond. People will suffer. And I can't promise we'll win. All I can promise is that whatever happens, we face it standing up." The service ended not with a hymn or a benediction, but with silence and the sound of people walking out of the church into a future that had just become vastly more uncertain and infinitely more dangerous. Margaret waited until everyone else had left. "They're going to kill you," she said matter-of-factly. "Probably tonight, maybe tomorrow." "And you're ready for that?" Ernie thought about the question. Was anyone ever really ready to die? Ready to have their story end mid-sentence, unfinished and unresolved? "No," he admitted. "But I'm done running, done hiding, done being afraid. If Kane wants me dead, he'll have to come himself or send his best. And either way, Red Hollow will know the cost of taking a stand. And if we all die for nothing, then at least we died for something. That's more than most people get." She kissed him one last time, tears streaming down her face, then walked out into the cold morning light. Ernie stood alone in the empty church, listening to the silence, waiting for the violence he knew was coming. He didn't have to wait long. The attack came at midnight, when the town was dark and vulnerable, and the good people of Red Hollow had retreated behind locked doors to wait for morning or death, whichever arrived first. Ernie heard them before he saw them. The careful creak of floorboards in the church sanctuary, the whisper of boots on wood, the metallic click of a revolver being cocked. He'd been expecting this, had barely slept since the sermon ended, sitting in his small room with the lamp extinguished and his Colt in his hand, waiting for Kane's response. 3 men, maybe 4. coming through the front of the church while others probably circled the back to cut off escape. Standard tactics for men who killed for money and didn't believe in fair fights. Ernie moved silently to the window, assessing options. The graveyard out back offered cover but was also the obvious escape route. They'd have it covered. The front meant running straight into whoever was creeping through the sanctuary. The only real choice was to not run at all, to make them come to him in a space he controlled. He positioned himself beside the door, gun raised, breathing steady, waiting. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters, and a man rushed through firing wildly. Not Hayes or Cutter, but someone younger, less experienced, probably hired cheap for this exact kind of dirty work. Ernie shot him twice in the chest before the kid even registered where he was. The body dropped hard, blood spreading across the floor like spilled ink. Gunfire erupted from the sanctuary, bullets punching through the thin walls, tearing apart the small room, destroying the bed and desk and everything Ernie didn't actually care about because he'd never owned anything worth mourning. He rolled through the doorway low and fast, coming up behind a pew with his Colt tracking for targets. 2 men in the center aisle, both firing at where Ernie had been instead of where he was. Amateur hour. He put one down with a shot to the throat, watched him collapse gurgling and drowning in his own blood. The second man dove for cover, smarter than his companion, firing blind over the pew. "You can leave," Ernie called out, reloading with practiced efficiency. "Walk out now. Tell Kane I'm harder to kill than he thought." "Kane says you die tonight, preacher," the man shouted back. "Says he'll pay double if we bring him your head." "Then I guess you better earn your money." The man came around the pew firing, brave or stupid. Ernie couldn't decide which. It didn't matter. Ernie's shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second shot finished what the first started. Silence descended, broken only by Ernie's breathing and the ringing in his ears from gunfire in an enclosed space. 3 dead men bleeding on the church floor and somewhere in the darkness outside, at least one more waiting to see if his companions succeeded. Ernie moved to the front door, staying low, peering out into the street. A 4th man sat on a horse 50 yards away, silhouetted against the moonlight, holding the reins of 3 other mounts. The getaway man, the smart one who'd let others take the risk while he waited to collect the reward. The man saw movement in the church doorway and fired twice, wild shots that went high and wide. Then he wheeled his horse and galloped into the darkness, leaving his dead partners behind like abandoned baggage. Ernie stood in the doorway, gun still in hand, watching the rider disappear. His hands were steady, his breathing was calm. He'd killed 3 men in under 2 minutes, and the only thing he felt was a hollow kind of relief that it was them instead of him. That's what the frontier did to you, he thought. Made killing mechanical, made death ordinary, made the worst parts of being human feel like survival. Lights appeared in windows across the street. Townspeople woken by gunfire, too scared to investigate, but too curious to ignore. Ernie saw shadows moving behind curtains, faces peering out before quickly retreating. Margaret arrived first, running down the street with her skirts hiked up and a shotgun in her hands that looked too big for her frame, but was held with enough confidence to suggest she knew how to use it. "Ernie!" She stopped at the church steps, taking in the bodies visible through the open door. "Are you hurt?" "No, they were sloppy. Kane didn't send his best." "He sent them as a message," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "This is what happens when you defy him. This is just the beginning." Old Dutch appeared next, then Ben Miller, then a dozen others. The same people who'd stood in church that morning, drawn by violence to see if their preacher had survived his first real test. "Sweet Jesus," Ben breathed, staring at the carnage. "You killed them all." "They came to kill me. I disagreed with the plan." Doc Harrison pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand, though there was nothing medicine could do for men with bullets in their vital organs. He checked each body methodically, confirming what everyone already knew. "Dead," he announced unnecessarily. "All 3. Clean shots. Professional work." "I'm not a professional," Ernie said quietly. "Just lucky and mean enough to survive." Sheriff Barrow arrived last, huffing from the exertion of walking 2 blocks. He surveyed the scene with an expression caught between anger and calculation, trying to figure out how to spin this for Kane while maintaining the pretense of law enforcement. "This is murder, Reverend," Barrow said, reaching for his gun. "You just killed 3 men in cold blood. I'm placing you under arrest." Ernie's Colt swung up so fast Barrow froze mid-sentence, his hand still hovering over his holster. Those three men broke into a church at midnight, armed and firing, Ernie said, his voice deadly calm. Every person in this town heard the gunshots. This was self-defense, and you know it. The only question is whether you're stupid enough to die defending Kane's hired killers. The crowd shifted, murmuring. Barrow looked around, reading the room, realizing he was surrounded by people who'd watched him enable Kane's cruelty for 5 years and were, maybe, finally, tired of pretending he represented justice. "This ain't over," Barrow said, backing toward his horse. "Kane will hear about this, and when he does—" "Tell Kane I'm still here," Ernie interrupted. "Tell him his boys weren't good enough. Tell him to send better, or come himself." Barrow fled into the darkness, leaving Ernie standing in the church doorway surrounded by death and witnesses, and the dawning realization that he'd just declared open war on the most powerful man in the territory. "You can't stay here tonight," Margaret said practically. "Kane will send more, better men. They'll burn this church with you inside." "Where should I go? I can't leave town. That's what Kane wants." "My house," she said firmly. "It's small, but it's defensible. Windows on all sides, good sight lines, and no one would expect you to hide there." Ernie started to protest. Putting Margaret in danger seemed worse than facing Kane's killers alone, but she cut him off with a look that could melt steel. "Don't argue with me, Ernie Hale. I lost one man to Kane's violence. I won't lose another by being too proud to accept help." So he went, following Margaret through dark streets while others volunteered to stand watch, to clean the bodies from the church, to make sure Kane's next wave of assassins didn't catch them unprepared. Margaret's house sat on the edge of town, a modest 2-room structure with a small kitchen and a bedroom barely big enough for the iron bed that dominated it. She'd lived here alone since Samuel died, Ernie realized. Lived with his ghost and her grief and the knowledge that the man who'd killed her husband walked free and untouchable. "You can have the bed," Margaret said, lighting lamps with efficient movements. "I'll take the chair by the window. Keep watch." "I'm not taking your bed." "Then we'll both keep watch." She settled into the rocking chair, shotgun across her lap, looking like some frontier version of a guardian angel, armed and dangerous and absolutely unwilling to compromise. Ernie sat on the floor with his back against the wall, where he could see both windows and the door. They stayed like that for hours, not speaking, just existing in the charged silence of two people waiting for violence that might or might not come before dawn. "Tell me about before," Margaret said finally, her voice soft in the darkness. "Before you were Reverend Blackwell. Before you were a wanted man. Who was Ernie Hale when he was just a boy?" Ernie thought back to Missouri, to the farm that burned, to parents whose faces had faded into memory's fog until he could barely remember what they looked like when they smiled. "Nobody special," he said. "Farm kid. Good with horses. Decent shot because my father needed help keeping foxes away from the chickens. I was going to take over the farm someday, marry some local girl, raise children who'd take over after me. Simple. Boring. Safe. What happened? Fire. Started in the barn, spread to the house. I was 16, spending the night at a friend's place. Came home to ashes and bodies, and the understanding that the future I'd imagined had burned away in a single night. I'm sorry. Don't be. That was a long time ago. Different life. Different person." He paused. "After that, I drifted. Took work where I could find it. Learned that men with guns and no attachments could always find employment, even if the employment was occasionally illegal. Rode with a few cattle drives, guarded some payrolls, tracked down horse thieves for ranchers who paid in cash and didn't ask questions. And the murder charge? Wrong place, wrong time, wrong face. A man was killed in a saloon fight in Nebraska. I'd been in that saloon earlier that night, had an argument with the bartender over watered-down whiskey. When the body turned up, someone remembered my face, remembered the argument, and decided that was evidence enough. They arrested me, tried me in about 15 minutes, and had the rope around my neck before I could even hire a lawyer. But the real killer confessed. Guilt, maybe, or fear of hell, or just couldn't live with watching an innocent man die for his crime. Either way, he spoke up at the last second. Sheriff cut me down, set me free, then suggested I leave town before the good citizens decided I was guilty anyway, and finished what they started. Margaret rocked slowly, processing the story. "So you know what it's like, to be powerless. to face injustice and have no recourse. That's why I can't run from Cain, because I know exactly what happens when good people stand by and watch evil operate unchecked. The innocent die, the guilty prosper. And everyone pretends that's just how the world works, so why fight it? And you think we can fight it? Really fight it, not just make a gesture before Cain crushes us? Ernie was quiet for a long moment, considering honesty versus comfort. He chose honesty. I don't know. Cain has money, men, political connections. We have desperation and a drifter pretending to be a preacher. On paper, we've already lost. Then why bother? Because losing while fighting is different than losing while kneeling. Because maybe we plant a seed that grows into something years from now. Because... He stopped, searching for the right words. Because I'm tired of being afraid, Margaret. Tired of running. Tired of watching men like Cain win because everyone's too scared to tell them no. Even if this ends with me in the ground, at least I'll know I finally stood for something. She left the rocking chair and sat beside him on the floor, her shoulder touching his, sharing warmth in the cold room. Samuel used to say the same thing, she whispered, right before he organized the ranchers, right before he got himself killed. Do you regret that he tried? Every day, and not at all. I lost my husband, but at least I lost him to courage instead of cowardice. At least my children can know their father died fighting for something he believed in. She turned to look at him. But I don't want to lose you the same way, Ernie. I don't want to bury another good man because he thought dying heroically was better than living. I'm not planning to die. No one ever plans to. It just happens. Usually when you're trying to do something noble. They sat together in the darkness, listening to the wind outside and the settling sounds of the old house and the distant bark of a dog that couldn't sleep either. Somewhere in the night, Cain was planning his next move. Somewhere in town, people were deciding whether to support Ernie or abandon him. And somewhere in the future, there was either salvation or slaughter, victory or graves. But in this moment, none of that mattered. There was just two broken people finding comfort in proximity, sharing space and warmth, and the fragile hope that maybe tomorrow wouldn't be the day everything collapsed. Morning came with frost and the realization that Cain hadn't sent more killers during the night, which was somehow more ominous than if he had. It meant he was planning something bigger, something worse, something that would make 3 dead assassins look like a polite warning. Ernie returned to the church at dawn to find it exactly as he'd left it, minus the bodies. Someone had cleaned the blood and dragged the corpses to the undertakers. The bullet holes remained, though, stark reminders punched through walls and pews, telling the story of violence in the house meant for peace. He was standing in the sanctuary, assessing damage, when Jake Cutter walked through the front door. Ernie's hand moved toward his gun, but Cutter held both palms up in a gesture of peace. Easy, Hale. I'm not here for trouble. Then why are you here? Cutter surveyed the bullet-scarred church, his expression unreadable. To warn you, and to make one last offer, though I suspect I already know your answer. I'm listening. Cain's done playing games. You killed 3 of his men, low-level thugs, true, but still his property. That's a challenge he can't ignore. He's bringing in professionals, real killers, not the incompetent trash he sent last night. How many? 8, maybe 10, led by a man named Silas Cord. You know that name? Ernie did. Every gunfighter in the territories knew Silas Cord, a cold-blooded killer who'd reportedly put down 17 men in fair duels and twice that many in ambushes and assassinations. He was expensive, efficient, and completely without conscience. Cord doesn't work cheap, Ernie said. No, but Cain's pride is expensive, and you just bought yourself a whole lot of his attention. Cutter moved closer, his voice dropping. Here's my offer. Last chance. I can get you out. Tonight. I know routes Cain doesn't watch, places you can hide until his attention shifts elsewhere. Bring Margaret if you want. But you leave, and you leave now, before Cord arrives. And Red Hollow? Learns to live with Cain, just like before you arrived. Ernie studied Cutter's face, looking for the angle, the trick. But all he saw was genuine concern mixed with the pragmatic acceptance of a man who'd learned not to waste energy on lost causes. Why do you care? Ernie asked. Because I like you. Because killing you feels wasteful when you could be useful. And because... Cutter hesitated, something almost vulnerable crossing his features. Because I used to be you, young, righteous, convinced I could make a difference. The frontier beat that out of me, but I remember what it felt like. Remember thinking some things were worth dying for. What changed? I got older, watched good men die for causes that didn't matter a year later. Realized that survival beats martyrdom every single time, because dead heroes don't enjoy their legacy. He met Ernie's eyes. Don't be a dead hero, Hale. Be a living cynic. It's less inspiring, but much more comfortable. Can't do it. I appreciate the offer, truly, but I'm done running. Cutter sighed, the sound of a man who'd expected this answer, but hoped for different. Then let me give you something else. Information. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, handed it over. Ernie opened it to find a hand-drawn map of Kane's ranch. The main house, the bunkhouse, the barn, guard positions, blind spots. Why? Ernie asked, confused. Because Kane thinks you'll sit in town waiting for Cord to hunt you down. He's not expecting you to go on offense. This map shows the weak points in his defense. If you're crazy enough to attack, those are your entry points. You're helping me kill your employer. I'm giving you options. What you do with them is your choice. Cutter headed for the door, then paused. Cord arrives in 2 days. Maybe 3 if weather slows him. Whatever you're planning, do it before he gets here. Because once Cord's involved, you're not walking away alive. He left Ernie standing in the ruined church, holding a map that was either salvation or suicide, depending on how you used it. That afternoon, Ernie called a meeting in the church. Everyone who'd stood during Sunday's sermon, plus a few others who'd heard about the midnight attack and decided maybe the preacher was serious about fighting back. 30 people showed up. Not an army, barely a militia, but it was what Ernie had to work with. Kane's bringing in a professional killer named Silas Cord, Ernie began without preamble. Once Cord arrives, we lose. He's better than me, better than anyone here. Our only chance is to act first before Kane expects it. Act how? Old Dutch asked. Ernie spread Cutter's map on the altar. We hit Kane's ranch. Not to kill him, though that'd be nice, but to destroy his credibility. Burn his barn, scatter his cattle, show the valley that he's not invincible. Shocked silence greeted this suggestion. That's suicide, Ben Miller said flatly. Kane has 20 men at that ranch. We'd be slaughtered. Not if we're smart. Not if we hit at night, fast and hard, then disappear before they organize a response. Ernie pointed to the map. Cutter gave me this. It shows guard positions, blind spots. We can get in and out if we move quick. Why would Cutter help us? Margaret asked suspiciously. Because he's planning his own exit from Kane's employment and wants chaos to cover his tracks. Or because he's setting a trap. Either way, this is our only play. Wait for Cord, and we die. Run, and Kane wins. Attack, and we might change the equation. You're asking us to become what we hate, Doc Harrison said quietly. Asking us to use violence and destruction, just like Kane. I'm asking you to survive. There's a difference between aggression and self-defense. Kane started this war 5 years ago. We're just finally fighting back. The room erupted in argument, some supporting the plan, others calling it madness. Everyone scared and desperate and looking for an answer that didn't exist. Ernie let them argue, watching faces, gauging commitment. Finally, Margaret stood. I'll go, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. Samuel tried to fight Kane face to face, and it got him killed. Maybe it's time we tried fighting dirty. Margaret, no, Ernie started. Don't, Margaret, no, me. You need people who can ride and shoot. I can do both. And I have more reason than anyone here to hurt Kane. Old Dutch stood next. Then young Tom Rodriguez, whose sister had been ruined by Kane's men. Then Ben Miller, surprising everyone including himself. One by one, they committed. Not everyone, some left, too scared or too smart to join what looked like a suicide mission. But 12 stayed. 12 people willing to raid the ranch of the most powerful man in the territory. It wasn't much, but it was something. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Ernie taught basic tactics to people who'd never raided anything more dangerous than a henhouse. Margaret distributed weapons from her late husband's collection, rifles that hadn't been fired in 5 years, revolvers that needed cleaning, ammunition that had to be checked for corrosion. As the sun set, Painting the sky in shades of blood and copper, they gathered at the edge of town, 12 amateur fighters about to take on a fortified ranch defended by professional killers. Last chance to back out, Ernie said. No shame in choosing survival over glory. No one moved. They were committed, for better or worse. All right then, Ernie said quietly. Let's go remind Victor Kane what fear feels like. They rode out under a darkening sky, following trails that wound through the hills toward Kane's ranch. Ernie led, using Cutter's map to navigate, hoping the information was accurate and not a trap designed to get them all killed. The ranch appeared around midnight. Lights blazing in windows, guards posted at the main gate, exactly as Cutter's map indicated. Ernie split his small force into 3 groups, one to scatter the horses and cattle, one to set fires in the barn and outbuildings, and one to provide covering fire if things went wrong, which they inevitably would. Remember, Ernie whispered, fast and loud. Make them think there's an army out here. Don't stand and fight, hit and run, then disappear into the hills. Margaret gripped his hand briefly. Don't die stupidly, Ernie Hale. I'll do my best. They moved into position, using the darkness and the blind spots Cutter had marked. Ernie's heart pounded, not from fear exactly, but from the knowledge that everything was about to change. This was the point of no return. After tonight, there'd be no pretending he was just a preacher, no hiding behind a collar and a Bible. This was open war, and wars only ended one way, victory or graves. He gave the signal. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously, not aimed to kill, but to create chaos and confusion. Guards scattered, unsure how many attackers they faced or where the real threat was. In the confusion, Old Dutch and 2 others broke the corral fence, sending horses stampeding into the night. Ben Miller's group lit torches and threw them into the barn, into the hayloft, into anything that would burn. Flames caught instantly, roaring to life with unnatural speed. Someone had doused the barn in coal oil earlier, making Ernie wonder if they had a saboteur inside Kane's organization. The fire climbed into the night sky, bright enough to turn midnight into false dawn, painting everything in shades of orange and shadow. Shouts erupted from the main house. More guards poured out, firing wildly into the darkness. Ernie's group returned fire, careful to aim high, to wound instead of kill. They were raiders, not murderers. Not yet, anyway. Fall back, Ernie shouted, seeing movement near the bunkhouse that suggested the defenders were organizing. Time to go! They retreated into the hills in small groups, exactly as planned, scattering in different directions to confuse pursuit. Ernie stayed last, covering their escape, trading shots with shadows until his ammunition ran low and common sense demanded retreat. He mounted Sable and galloped into the darkness, the burning ranch disappearing behind him, the sound of chaos and confusion echoing across the valley like thunder. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd actually done it. But as Ernie rode through the cold night, he knew this was just the beginning. Kane wouldn't absorb this insult quietly. He'd respond with overwhelming force, with Silas Cord and his killers, with every ounce of power he'd accumulated over 5 years. The war had begun, and Ernie had no idea how to win it. The rendezvous point was an abandoned line shack 5 miles from town, hidden in a canyon where the wind howled like dying things. Ernie arrived first, followed gradually by the others, most on horseback, a few on foot after their mounts threw them in the confusion. He did a quick head count. 12 had ridden out. 11 came back. "Where's Tom?" Margaret asked, reading Ernie's expression. "Took a bullet during the retreat," young Sarah Kowalski said, her voice shaking. "He fell from his horse. We tried to go back, but there were too many guards." "You did the right thing," Ernie said, though the words tasted like ash. Tom Rodriguez was 19 years old, probably dead or captured now, paying the price for Ernie's war. They huddled in the shack, exhausted and scared, adrenaline fading to leave only the cold reality of what they'd done and what it would cost. "We heard him," Old Dutch said, a fierce satisfaction in his voice. "Burned his barn, scattered his stock. Kane's gonna feel that." "Kane's gonna feel rage," Doc Harrison corrected, "and he's gonna take it out on all of us." "Then we hit him again," Margaret said, surprising everyone. "Before he recovers. Before Cord arrives. We keep hitting until Kane realizes we're not afraid anymore." "We are afraid," Ben Miller said quietly. "We're terrified, but we're doing it anyway. That's what makes it brave. They talked strategy until dawn, planning more raids, more disruptions, more ways to make Kane's life difficult. It was guerrilla warfare on a frontier that had never seen organized resistance to land barons and their hired guns. Ernie listened mostly, adding tactical suggestions, trying to keep these well-meaning amateurs from getting themselves killed. But a part of him marveled at the transformation. These were the same people who'd asked him to leave just days ago. Now they were planning raids and ambushes, talking about resistance like it was possible. Maybe that was the real victory, Ernie thought. Not burning Kane's barn, but burning away the fear that had paralyzed Red Hollow for 5 years. When the sun rose, painting the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold, they rode back to town in small groups, trying not to draw attention. But the smoke from Kane's ranch was visible for miles, a black column rising into the morning sky, announcing to everyone in the valley that something had changed. Ernie and Margaret rode together, the last to leave the shack. "Tom's death is on me," Ernie said quietly. "I led him into that raid. Tom chose to come, just like we all chose. Don't take away his agency by making his death your fault. 17 men dead so far. 3 assassins, Tom, and 13 others over the past 5 years. How many more before this ends? As many as it takes, or until Kane kills us all." Margaret looked at him, her eyes hard. "You can't save everyone, Ernie. You can only give people a choice and hope they choose bravely." They arrived in Red Hollow to find the town transformed. Word of the raid had spread, probably from Kane's surviving guards, and people lined the streets to see the raiders return. Some faces showed fear. Others showed something that might have been pride. Sheriff Barrow waited in front of the church, looking haggard and defeated. "Kane sent a message," Barrow said, his voice devoid of its usual bluster. "He's offering clemency. Anyone who participated in last night's raid can turn themselves in, face trial, and receive mercy. Those who don't," he swallowed hard, "those who don't will be hunted down and executed when Silas Cord arrives." "When does Cord arrive?" Ernie asked. "Tomorrow. Maybe the day after." Barrow met Ernie's eyes, and for the first time, there was something like respect there. "You really did it. You actually hurt him. No one's ever hurt Victor Kane before." "There's a first time for everything. And probably a last time, too. Cord's gonna kill you, Hale, kill all of you. And I can't stop him because Kane owns me, owns the law, owns everything." Barrow's voice cracked. "I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I'm sorry I wasn't stronger." He walked away, shoulders slumped, a broken man who'd sold his integrity so long ago he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand for something. Ernie stood in the street, surrounded by townspeople who looked to him for answers he didn't have. Silas Cord was coming. The reckoning was coming. And all Ernie had was 12 amateurs, a handful of weapons, and the hope that courage could somehow overcome experience and firepower. It wasn't much to bet a town's survival on, but it was all they had. That night, Ernie didn't sleep. He sat in Margaret's house cleaning weapons and running through scenarios, each one ending badly. Silas Cord wasn't some hired thug who could be outmaneuvered with luck and desperation. Cord was a professional, a man who'd built his reputation on never losing, never hesitating, never showing mercy. Margaret sat across from him, mending a torn shirt by lamplight, her movements automatic and practiced. The silence between them had grown comfortable over the past days, the kind of quiet that came from two people who'd stopped needing words to communicate. "You're planning something stupid," she said without looking up from her sewing. "I'm planning something necessary. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive." She set down the shirt, met his eyes. "You're going to face Cord alone, aren't you? Some misguided notion about protecting the rest of us." Ernie didn't answer, which was answer enough. "You can't beat him, Ernie. Everyone who's faced Silas Cord is dead. All 17 of them, and those are just the ones people know about. He's faster, more experienced, and he doesn't care about honor or fair fights or anything except winning." "I know. Then why? Because if I don't face him, he'll hunt everyone who rode with me last night. He'll make examples. He'll kill until Red Hollow remembers what fear tastes like and goes back to being Kane's property." Ernie leaned forward. "But if I face him, really face him, make it personal, maybe Kane's satisfied with just killing me. Maybe the rest of you get to live. And you think Kane will honor that? Let us go after your dead? No, but it buys time. buys space for people to scatter, to hide, to maybe survive long enough for the territorial marshal to finally pay attention. Margaret stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. I won't let you martyr yourself for people who will forget your name before you're cold in the ground. I won't, her voice broke. I won't bury another man I loved because he thought dying bravely was better than living. The word hung in the air between them like a confession neither had planned to make. You love me, Ernie said quietly. Of course I love you, you stubborn fool. I've loved you since you stood at the Mitchell farm and refused to let evil operate unchallenged, since you wore that ridiculous collar and pretended to be something you weren't just to give people hope. Tears streamed down her face. And now you're going to throw that away facing a killer you can't beat, and I'm supposed to just accept it? Ernie crossed to her, pulled her close, felt her shake with sobs against his chest. He'd spent so many years alone, so many years convinced that connection was dangerous, and love was a liability. But holding Margaret now, feeling her warmth and her fear and her desperate need for him to survive, he realized that maybe being alone wasn't strength, it was just cowardice dressed up as independence. I love you too, he whispered into her hair, which is why I can't let you die for my war. This isn't just your war anymore. It stopped being yours the moment people stood with you at the Mitchell farm, the moment they raided Kane's ranch. She pulled back, gripping his face with both hands. We're in this together, Ernie, all of us. And if you try to face Cord alone, you're not being noble, you're being selfish, robbing us of the choice to fight beside you. Before Ernie could respond, someone pounded on the door, urgent, desperate knocking that spoke of crisis. Ernie grabbed his Colt, moved to the window. Old Dutch stood outside, breathing hard, his horse lathered from hard riding. Open up, Dutch called. News from the road. Margaret unlatched the door. Dutch stumbled inside, his face grave. Cord's here, he gasped. Rode in an hour ago with 9 men. They're at Kane's ranch now, planning something. My nephew works the stable there. He risked his neck sneaking out to warn us. 9 men plus Cord, Ernie calculated, plus whatever's left of Kane's regular guards. We're outnumbered 3-1 minimum. Worse than that, Dutch continued. Kane's called a town meeting, tomorrow at noon in the square. Says he's offering one final chance for peace. Anyone who participated in the raid can confess, and he'll show mercy. Those who don't, Dutch's voice dropped. Cord demonstrated what happens to people who don't cooperate. They hung young Tom Rodriguez from the old oak tree on the town's edge, left him there as a warning. Margaret made a sound like she'd been punched. Tom had been just a boy, barely 20, with a whole life ahead of him. Now he was a corpse decorating a tree, a message written in rope and death. Kane's drawing us out, Ernie said, his voice cold and analytical despite the rage burning in his chest. The meeting's a trap. He wants everyone gathered in one place where Cord can identify the raiders. So we don't go, Dutch said. We scatter, hide in the hills until when? Until Kane burns the town looking for us? Until he starts executing people randomly to flush us out? Ernie shook his head. No, he's forced our hand. We have to show up, or innocent people suffer. Then we're walking into an ambush. Yes, which means we need to turn the ambush around. Ernie moved to the table, began sketching a rough map of Red Hollow's main square. Kane thinks we're disorganized, scared, easy to break. Let's show him different. They spent the next hour planning, not a defense, but an offensive so audacious it bordered on suicide. If Kane wanted a confrontation in the town square, they'd give him one, but on their terms. By the time Dutch left to spread word among the other raiders, dawn was breaking across the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of blood that seemed grimly appropriate for what was coming. Margaret stood at the window, watching the sunrise. We're all going to die tomorrow, aren't we? Probably, Ernie admitted. But we'll die standing up. That's more than most people get. Is it enough? Is dying bravely really better than living scared? Ernie thought about that question. Thought about all the years he'd spent running, surviving, choosing breath over principle. Those years had kept him alive, true, but had they been worth living? Had that been life, or just existence stretched thin across too many empty days? I don't know, he said honestly. Ask me tomorrow if we're still breathing. The morning of the town meeting dawned cold and clear. frost painting intricate patterns on windows like nature's last artwork before violence erased everything. Ernie dressed carefully, not in the preacher's black coat, but in range clothes and his gun belt, no longer pretending to be anything except what he was. A drifter who'd stopped drifting. A gunman who'd found something worth fighting for. The raiders gathered at the church one last time. 12 had ridden to Kane's ranch. 11 had returned. Now they numbered 13. Old Dutch had recruited his nephew, Samuel, the stable boy who'd warned them about Cord, a kid barely 16 who'd watched them hang Tom Rodriguez and decided he'd rather die fighting than live kneeling. "Anyone wants to leave? Now's the time," Ernie said. "No judgment, no shame. What we're about to do is dangerous and probably stupid." No one moved. "All right then, here's the plan. Kane expects us to show up scared and disorganized. Instead, we show up armed and spread out through the crowd. When Cord makes his move, and he will make a move, we don't let him isolate targets. We protect each other, create crossfire, make it too expensive for them to take us down." "You're talking about a gunfight in the middle of town," Doc Harrison said. "Innocent people will be caught in the crossfire." "Innocent people are already caught in Kane's crossfire, have been for 5 years. At least this way they see us fighting back." Ben Miller cleared his throat. "What about Kane himself? He'll be protected, surrounded by guards." "Kane's mine," Ernie said flatly. "This ends with him, one way or another." Margaret stepped forward, a rifle in her hands that had belonged to Samuel. "And Cord? If I'm lucky, I take him before he takes me. If I'm not..." Ernie shrugged. "Then you run. Scatter to the hills, disappear, live to fight another day." "We're not running," Margaret said, and the others murmured agreement. They'd crossed too many lines, burned too many bridges. Running wasn't an option anymore. They walked to the square together, a ragged group of farmers and shopkeepers who'd decided that death with dignity beat survival without it. Townspeople lined the streets, watching with expressions ranging from fear to awe to condemnation. This was it. The moment Red Hollow would either find its spine or break completely. The square was already crowded when they arrived. Kane had done his work well. Nearly the entire town had shown up, drawn by curiosity or fear or the morbid desire to watch what happened when ordinary people challenged power. Victor Kane stood on a raised platform in front of the general store's burned-out shell, flanked by guards. He dressed for the occasion, expensive suit, gold watch chain, every inch the civilized gentleman bringing order to chaos. Beside him stood Silas Cord. Ernie had built an image of Cord in his mind, some massive, scarred brute, all violence and menace. The reality was different and somehow worse. Cord was average height, slim build, with gray temples and a face that could have belonged to a banker or a teacher. He wore a simple black vest over a white shirt, twin revolvers at his hips, and carried himself with the absolute confidence of a man who'd never lost because he'd never fought fair. Their eyes met across the crowded square. Cord smiled, a thin, measuring expression that said he'd already calculated how this would end and found Ernie's odds wanting. "Citizens of Red Hollow," Kane began, his voice carrying across the square. "We've come to a crossroads. For 5 years, I've brought prosperity to this valley. Jobs, investment, order. And how have I been repaid? With arson, with violence, with ingratitude from people who should be thanking me for everything I've built." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some agreement, some dissent, everyone uncertain how this would end. "But I'm a reasonable man," Kane continued, "a forgiving man. So I'm offering one final chance for peace. Those who participated in the raid on my ranch can step forward now, confess their crimes, and face justice. Those who do will receive mercy, prison time, not execution. Those who don't," he gestured to Cord. "Well, Mr. Cord is very good at finding people who hide." Silence. No one moved. The 13 raiders stood scattered through the crowd, hands near weapons, waiting. Kane's expression hardened. "Very well. Since no one wants to confess voluntarily, let me be clear about what happens next. Mr. Cord and his associates will identify the guilty. They will be arrested, tried, and executed. Anyone who resists will be shot. Anyone who helps them will be shot. This town will return to order, one way or another." "Your order," Ernie called out, stepping forward through the crowd. "Your tyranny dressed up as civilization." Kane's eyes found him. "Ah, the false preacher. The drifter who thought wearing a collar made him holy. Tell me, Mr. Hale, how many people have died because you filled their heads with foolish hope? 4 that I know of, plus 17 more over the past 5 years that you've killed or had killed. I'd say my body count's significantly lower than yours. Those deaths were necessary. Lessons that needed teaching. Lessons in fear, in submission, in accepting that might makes right. Ernie moved closer to the platform, his hand near his Colt. But here's what you didn't count on, Kane. People can only be afraid for so long before fear turns to rage, before they'd rather die fighting than live as your property. Brave words from a dead man. Kane nodded to Cord. Kill him. Cord's hands moved toward his revolvers, and froze when every one of Ernie's raiders drew their weapons simultaneously, 13 guns appearing from the crowd, all aimed at the platform. Here's my counteroffer, Ernie said calmly. You leave. Pack up, sell your ranch, disappear to San Francisco or New York or wherever men like you go when their empires collapse. Do that, and you live. Stay, and we end this the hard way. Kane laughed, genuine amusement mixed with outrage. You think 13 farmers with guns frighten me? I have Silas Cord and 9 professional killers, plus my regular guards. You're outnumbered and outmatched. Maybe, but we're also willing to die. Are you? Ernie drew his Colt in one smooth motion, aimed it at Kane's chest. Because that's the difference between us. You've gotten soft hiding behind hired guns. I've got nothing left to lose. For a heartbeat, the entire square held its breath. 2 forces facing each other across an unbridgeable divide, both committed, both armed, violence trembling in the air like heat lightning. Then Cord drew. He was fast, faster than anyone Ernie had ever seen, his revolvers clearing leather in a blur that seemed almost supernatural. But Ernie had been expecting it, had watched Cord's eyes for the tell, the slight shift that came before movement. Ernie dove left as Cord's first shot went high. Ernie's return fire caught Cord in the shoulder, spinning him around. Then the square exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from a dozen directions at once. Kane's guards returned fire. Civilians screamed and scattered, and in the middle of it all, Ernie rolled behind a water trough, reloading while bullets punched through wood around him. Margaret was 15 feet away, crouched behind a barrel, trading shots with one of Cord's men. Old Dutch had taken position on the general store's porch, his rifle barking methodically. Ben Miller was down, clutching his leg, but still firing with his revolver. Ernie searched for Kane, found him being hustled off the platform by 2 guards, running for the hotel. Ernie broke from cover, sprinting after them, ignoring the bullets that whined past his head. One of Kane's guards turned, aimed. Ernie shot him in the chest without breaking stride. The second guard raised his hands in surrender. Ernie left him, focused entirely on Kane, who disappeared through the hotel's front entrance. Ernie kicked through the door, Colt raised, found Kane on the stairs trying to reach the second floor. Their eyes met. Kane pulled a small pistol from his coat pocket, something decorative and expensive that probably couldn't hit anything beyond 10 feet. It's over, Kane, Ernie said. Your men are dying. Your empire's crumbling. You've got one choice left, surrender or die. Never. Kane fired wildly, his shot going wide. I built this valley from nothing, made it profitable, made it matter. And you're just some drifter who got lucky. You think killing me changes anything? I think it proves you're mortal. That's enough. Kane fired again. This time the bullet grazed Ernie's arm, a hot line of pain that was more surprising than debilitating. Ernie's return shot caught Kane in the chest, center mass, dropping him on the stairs. Kane slumped against the railing, blood spreading across his expensive shirt, his breathing labored. You've doomed this town. Without me, there's no order, no structure, just chaos. Maybe chaos is better than tyranny, Ernie said. Kane tried to respond, but blood filled his mouth. His eyes went distant, then empty. Victor Kane, the man who'd owned Red Hollow for 5 years, died on a hotel staircase with no one mourning him. Ernie turned to leave and found Jake Cutter standing in the doorway, gun drawn but not aimed. He's dead, Cutter said. Not a question, just confirmation. Yes. Good. Cutter holstered his weapon. For what it's worth, I'm glad it was you instead of me. Killing an employer's bad for future business prospects. What now? Now I collect the money Kane owed me and disappear. Montana, like I said, somewhere quiet where no one knows my name. Cutter paused. You should come. Offer still stands. You, Margaret, fresh start. Can't. Red Hollow needs to learn to stand on its own. You can't save them forever, Hale. Eventually, you'll have to let them save themselves. Outside, the gunfire had stopped. Either everyone was dead or the fighting had ended. Ernie moved past Cutter back into the square, dreading what he'd find. Bodies littered the street, Kane's guards, a few of Cord's men, and 2 of the raiders. Doc Harrison was moving among the wounded, triaging, trying to save lives with supplies too limited and skills too finite. Margaret knelt beside Ben Miller, bandaging his leg, her dress soaked with blood that might or might not be her own. And in the center of the square, surrounded by 6 guns pointed at his head, Silas Cord knelt with his hands raised. Blood streamed from his wounded shoulder, but his eyes were alert, calculating, looking for an opening that didn't exist. Old Dutch stood over him, rifle barrel pressed against Cord's temple. Say the word, Reverend. Say it, and I end him. Ernie approached slowly, studying the man who'd built a reputation on 17 kills and countless more that history didn't record. Up close, wounded and captured, Cord looked almost ordinary, just another frontier gunfighter who'd gotten old and slow and finally met someone faster. You beat me, Cord said quietly, something like respect in his voice. First time anyone has. How'd you know I'd draw first? Because you always draw first. It's in every story about you. Fast draw, no hesitation, no mercy. You're predictable, Cord, and predictable gets you killed. Or captured, apparently. Cord smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. What now? You execute me like some common criminal? I should. You've killed 17 men in duels, probably 50 more in ambushes and assassinations. You're a murderer for hire. And you're a drifter who pretended to be a preacher. We're both selling lies, Hale. I'm just more honest about it. Ernie wanted to pull the trigger, wanted to end Cord the way Cord had ended so many others. Quick, efficient, permanent. But killing a man in combat was different from executing one who'd surrendered. Get out, Ernie said finally. Leave Wyoming territory. If I ever see you again, if I ever hear you've taken another contract, I'll hunt you down and finish what I started. Understand? Cord nodded slowly. You're making a mistake. Men like me don't change. Then men like me will kill you next time. Ernie stepped back, gestured for Dutch to lower his rifle. Someone give him a horse and provisions. Then make sure he rides north and doesn't stop. You're just letting him go? Dutch protested. After everything, we're not executioners. We fought for justice, not vengeance. There's a difference. Cord was escorted to the stable, given the worst horse available and minimum supplies. He mounted slowly, his wounded shoulder making movement difficult. You're a better man than I gave you credit for, Hale, Cord said. That's probably why you'll die young. Good men usually do. Maybe, but at least I'll die good. What will you die as, Cord? Cord didn't answer. He rode north, disappearing into the hills, leaving Red Hollow and its revolution behind. The aftermath was grim. 4 raiders dead. Tom Rodriguez, Ben Miller, who'd bled out despite Doc Harrison's best efforts, young Samuel Dutch, and Clara Miller, who'd been caught in crossfire. 8 of Kane's men dead, including Hayes with his scar and his sneer. Sheriff Barrow had disappeared during the fighting, probably fled to the next county to avoid accountability. But Victor Kane was dead. His empire was broken, and for the first time in 5 years, Red Hollow was free. That night, they buried the dead in the cemetery behind the church. No grand eulogies, no pretense that death was anything except loss. Ernie stood over the fresh graves, hat in hand, searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow. They chose to fight, he said finally. Chose to stand instead of kneel. That doesn't make their deaths less tragic, but it makes them less meaningless. They mattered. Remember that. Margaret stood beside him, her hand finding his in the darkness. They were both wounded, her with a grazed shoulder, him with the bullet graze on his arm, but alive. Survivors of something that had felt impossible just days ago. What happens now? She asked quietly. Now you rebuild. Form a real town council. Elect a new sheriff who actually serves the people. Contact the territorial governor. Get legal recognition for your land claims. Make Red Hollow into what it should have been all along. You say you, like you're not staying. Ernie was silent for a long moment, staring at the graves. I'm a wanted man, Margaret. The murder charge might have been dismissed, but there's still a warrant. Still people looking for Ernie Hale. If I stay, I bring that trouble to your door. Then don't be Ernie Hale. Be Thomas Blackwell, the preacher who saved Red Hollow. I'm not a preacher. We both know that. Maybe not, but you're something close enough that it doesn't matter. She turned him to face her. Don't leave because you think you're protecting me. Don't leave because you're scared of staying. Leave because you honestly don't want to be here. Otherwise, stay and fight for something real instead of just fighting against things. Ernie looked at her. This woman who'd buried one husband and risked everything to stand beside a fraud in a collar. This woman who'd raided Kane's ranch and survived a gunfight in the town square. This woman who loved him despite knowing exactly who and what he was. I don't deserve you, he said. Probably not. But you're what I want anyway. She kissed him, soft and fierce. Stay, Ernie. Please. Help us build something worth dying for so maybe someday it becomes something worth living for. And standing there in the graveyard, surrounded by the cost of resistance and the promise of freedom, Ernie Hale made a choice he'd been avoiding his entire life. He chose to stay. The decision to stay should have brought peace. Instead, it brought a different kind of war, the slow, grinding battle of rebuilding something from ruins and blood and fragile hope. The first week after Kane's death, Ernie barely slept. He kept expecting retaliation. Kane's business partners from Cheyenne, territorial authorities demanding accountability for the violence, or some overlooked enemy emerging from the shadows. But the retaliation never came. Instead, something stranger happened. Silence. Kane's empire, built on fear and control, collapsed the moment its architect died. His ranch sat empty, his cattle scattered, his remaining employees either fled or integrated quietly into Red Hollow's population. It was as if 5 years of tyranny had been nothing more than a shared nightmare that evaporated in daylight. But the cost of that awakening lay in the cemetery behind the church, where fresh graves reminded everyone that freedom came with a price tag written in names and dates. Margaret threw herself into organizing, turning grief into productivity. Within days, she'd assembled a provisional town council: Old Dutch, Doc Harrison, Sarah Mitchell, and 3 others who'd proven themselves during the crisis. They met in the church every evening, hammering out laws and policies and the basic framework of governance. Ernie attended the meetings but stayed quiet, letting others shape Red Hollow's future. He'd never been good at building things, only at tearing down what needed destroying, but he watched Margaret lead with a combination of compassion and steel, watched her turn farmers into legislators and shopkeepers into civic leaders, and felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest that might have been pride. On the 8th day, a rider arrived from Cheyenne, not soldiers or marshals, but a territorial clerk carrying official documents. The town council gathered in the church to hear what authority had to say about their revolution. The clerk was a nervous man in his 30s, clearly uncomfortable delivering messages to people who'd recently won a gunfight against professional killers. He cleared his throat multiple times before speaking. The territorial governor has received reports about the recent events in Red Hollow, the death of Mr. Victor Kane, and the restructuring of local governance. He shuffled papers with trembling hands. After reviewing the circumstances, including testimonies from multiple sources, the governor has decided that Mr. Kane's death occurred during legitimate self-defense. No charges will be filed against participants in the conflict. Relief swept through the room like a physical force. People exhaled, embraced, allowed themselves to believe they might actually survive this. However, the clerk continued, and the room tensed again, there are concerns about the legal status of land claims. Mr. Kane purchased many properties through questionable means. The governor is establishing a commission to review all titles and determine rightful ownership. This process may take months. Months we don't have, Old Dutch growled. Winter's coming. People need to know if they can stay on their land or if some bureaucrat in Cheyenne's going to steal it out from under them. I understand your frustration, but the law required Victor Kane to not murder people who resisted his land grabs. Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp. The law required Sheriff Barrow to actually enforce justice instead of enabling tyranny. Forgive us for being skeptical about what the law requires now that we've done its work for it. The clerk flushed. I'm just the messenger, ma'am. I don't make policy. Then take a message back to your governor, Margaret said. Tell him Red Hollow will cooperate with his commission, but we expect fair treatment. We expect recognition that the people who bled to free this valley deserve to keep the land they fought for. And tell him that if his commission decides to reward Kane's heirs or business partners, we'll resist, peacefully if possible. Otherwise, if necessary. The clerk scribbled notes frantically. I'll convey your position. Is there anything else? Yes, Ernie said, speaking for the first time. All eyes turned to him. There's a wanted notice out for a man named Ernie Hale, accused of murder in Nebraska. The real killer confessed, but the paperwork might not have caught up. I need that warrant cleared. The clerk consulted his documents. Ernie Hale. Yes, there is a notice, but it's marked resolved. Charges dismissed after witness testimony confirmed his innocence. You're free to travel under your own name, Mr. Hale. Something tight in Ernie's chest loosened. He'd been Ernie Hale, then Thomas Blackwell, then some hybrid of both. Now finally, he could just be himself, whoever that was after everything that had happened. After the clerk left, promising to return with the commission within a month, the council dissolved into smaller conversations. Ernie found himself alone in the sanctuary, staring at the altar where he delivered sermons while pretending to be something he wasn't. You thinking about leaving? Jake Cutter stood in the doorway, looking travel-worn and tired. He'd disappeared after Kane's death, and Ernie had assumed he'd made it to Montana or wherever men like him went to retire from killing. Cutter, thought you'd be long gone by now. Got halfway to the territorial border and realized I'd forgotten something. Cutter moved into the church, his footsteps echoing. Came back to finish what I started. Ernie's hand drifted toward his gun, but Cutter held up both palms. Relax. I'm not here for violence. I'm here for answers. Cutter sat in a pew, looking oddly vulnerable without his usual predatory confidence. You won. Against Kane, against Cord, against odds that should have killed you 10 times over. How? Luck. Desperation. People willing to fight beside me. No, it's more than that. Cutter leaned forward. I've been a professional killer for 20 years. I've seen brave men die and cowards prosper. I've watched good intentions get buried and evil thrive. The frontier doesn't reward heroism, it punishes it. Yet somehow you broke that pattern. You stood up, and instead of getting crushed, you won. Why? Ernie thought about the question. Why had he survived when so many others hadn't? When Tom Rodriguez and Ben Miller and Samuel Dutch had paid with their lives for the same choices Ernie made? I don't know, he admitted. Maybe I just got lucky. Maybe the universe owed me one after the noose. Or maybe... He paused, searching for truth in his own motivations. Maybe I stopped caring about surviving and started caring about what I was surviving for. That changed the calculations. Changed them how? Men who fight to stay alive are predictable. They duck, run, protect themselves first. Men who fight for something bigger stop being predictable. They take risks that don't make sense. Stand when they should flee. And sometimes that irrational courage is the only advantage they need. Cutter absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. I spent 2 decades surviving by being smarter, faster, more ruthless than whoever I faced. Never once considered that maybe survival wasn't the point. He stood, extended his hand. Thank you, Hale. You gave me something I didn't know I was missing. What's that? A reason to stop. Cutter shook Ernie's hand firmly. I'm done killing for money. Done killing, period. If I can manage it. Figure I'll find that quiet ranch in Montana, raise cattle, die old and boring, maybe even learn to sleep without a gun under my pillow. Good luck with that last part, Ernie said with a slight smile. I'm still working on it myself. After Cutter left, this time for good, Ernie walked through Red Hollow's streets, taking inventory of what remained and what needed building. The general store was still a burned shell, but Ben's son had already started clearing debris, talking about rebuilding bigger and better. The saloon had reopened under new management, serving cheaper whiskey to men who could finally drink without Kane's shadow looming over them. The schoolhouse where Margaret taught was getting a fresh coat of paint, donated labor from families grateful their children could learn without fear. The town was healing. Slowly, painfully, but healing nonetheless. He found Margaret at the Mitchell farm, helping Sarah and her children repair their barn. She'd traded her mended dress for work clothes, her hair tied back, her hands dirty from honest labor. She looked beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with purpose. "You know you're not obligated to rebuild every structure in the valley," Ernie said, approaching. Margaret wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a dirt smear. "Someone has to. Might as well be people who understand what it costs to keep these places standing. You're going to exhaust yourself. I'm going to stay busy enough that I don't think too much about who's not here to help." Her voice caught slightly. "Ben should be rebuilding his store. Samuel should be helping his uncle with the forge. Tom should be—" She stopped, composed herself. "Staying busy helps." Ernie understood. Grief was easier to manage when buried under work and purpose. It was only in the quiet moments, in the stillness between tasks, that loss crept in and reminded you what you'd paid for victory. He picked up a hammer, started sorting nails. "Then I guess I'll stay busy too." They worked together through the afternoon, not talking much, just existing in comfortable proximity. Other townspeople joined. Old Dutch with his missing fingers, Doc Harrison taking a break from tending wounds, even young children carrying small pieces of lumber like they were precious cargo. The barn raising became a community event, a declaration that Red Hollow would rebuild itself one board at a time. As the sun set, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose, Ernie stood back to survey their progress. The barn wasn't finished, but its skeleton stood, rough timber and determination holding it upright. "It's not much yet," Sarah Mitchell said, standing beside him with her youngest child on her hip, "but it's ours. Nobody can take that away." "No," Ernie agreed. "Nobody can." That night, lying in Margaret's bed while she slept curled against him, Ernie allowed himself to think about the future, something he'd avoided his entire adult life. The future had always been an enemy, a space filled with nooses and bullets and betrayals. But maybe here, in this small town that had found its courage, the future could be different, could be something built instead of something endured. He was drifting toward sleep when Margaret stirred. "Ernie?" "Yeah?" "Promise me something." "What?" "Promise you won't leave without saying goodbye. If you wake up one morning and decide Red Hollow isn't enough, isn't worth staying for, just tell me. Don't disappear like some ghost who was never really here." Ernie pulled her closer. "I'm not leaving. You say that now, but you're a drifter. It's in your nature to move when things get comfortable. Maybe I'm tired of my nature. Maybe I want to learn what it's like to have a home." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Do you love me, Ernie Hale? Really love me, not just the idea of having someone after being alone so long?" It was the most direct question she'd ever asked him. No hiding behind implications or assumptions, just raw need for truth. "Yes," Ernie said. "I love you. I love your strength and your scars and the way you lead people without them realizing they're being led. I love that you see exactly who I am, a fraud and a killer and a man who's made more mistakes than right choices. And you love me anyway." "I do," she whispered. "Heaven help me. I do." "Then let's stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. Let's build something real and stop apologizing for wanting it." She kissed him, and in that kiss was acceptance and promise and the fragile hope that maybe broken people could build unbroken futures if they just refused to give up on each other. The Territorial Commission arrived 3 weeks later, led by a stern-faced judge named Harrison Blackwood, who'd spent 30 years adjudicating land disputes across the frontier. He brought 2 assistants, a stenographer, and enough legal documents to fill 3 wagons. The hearings were held in the church, the only building large enough to accommodate everyone with claims to settle. Judge Blackwood set up at the altar, transforming Ernie's pulpit into a bench, and began the tedious process of untangling 5 years of fraud and theft. It took 11 days. Testimony after testimony, deed after deed, witness after witness. Sarah Mitchell testified about her husband's murder and Cain's attempt to steal her land. The Johnson family detailed how their eldest son had died resisting eviction. The Rodriguezes, the Kowalskis, the Weavers, all told stories of loss and theft and systematic oppression. Ernie testified on the 8th day, no longer wearing the preacher's collar, just speaking as himself. He detailed everything, taking Thomas Blackwell's identity, arriving in Red Hollow, witnessing Kane's cruelty, organizing resistance. He expected judgment, possibly arrest for fraud and identity theft. Instead, Judge Blackwood listened impassively, made notes, and asked only one question. "Do you regret your actions, Mr. Hale?" Ernie thought carefully before answering. "I regret the people who died. I regret that violence was necessary. But I don't regret standing up to tyranny, even if I did it while pretending to be someone else. Thank you for your honesty." Blackwood wrote something in his ledger. "You may step down." On the 11th day, Judge Blackwood delivered his ruling from the altar, reading from a prepared statement in a voice that carried the weight of law and consequence. After careful review of all evidence and testimony, this commission finds that Victor Kane engaged in systematic fraud, intimidation, and murder to acquire land throughout this valley. All titles obtained through coercion or violence are hereby declared invalid and returned to their rightful owners or their heirs. Cheers erupted. People embraced, cried, allowed themselves to believe their homes were truly theirs again. Blackwood raised his hand for silence. However, properties purchased through legitimate transactions, where sellers were fairly compensated without coercion, remain under Kane's estate. These properties will be auctioned, with proceeds going to Kane's creditors and any remaining funds distributed to victims of his crimes. "What about the main ranch?" Old Dutch called out. "The ranch and its 15,000 acres are among the legitimate purchases. They will be auctioned in 60 days. Blackwood paused. "I'm also ruling on a separate matter, the actions taken by Red Hollow citizens in resisting Kane's tyranny. While vigilante justice is typically punishable under territorial law, this commission finds that residents acted in legitimate self-defense when legal authorities failed to provide protection. No criminal charges will be filed against anyone who participated in the resistance." More cheers, louder this time. Ernie felt tension he'd been carrying for weeks finally release. They were free, not just from Kane, but from the law's potential retribution. "Finally," Blackwood continued, "the territory recognizes Red Hollow's provisional government as legitimate. You may hold elections for permanent officials and establish yourselves as an incorporated township with full legal authority." After the judge finished and people dispersed to celebrate, Margaret found Ernie standing in the graveyard, looking at the headstones of those who hadn't lived to see victory validated. "They should be here," Ernie said quietly. "Should see what they died for actually meant something." "They know," Margaret said. "Wherever they are, they know." "You believe that? In an afterlife where people watch what happens after they're gone?" "I believe we carry the dead with us, in memory, in the choices we make because of them, in the world we build on foundations they laid." She took his hand. "Ben's son is rebuilding the store. Samuel's nephew is learning the forge. Tom's sister started teaching children music at the schoolhouse. The dead live through what they inspire, Ernie. That's the only immortality any of us get." They stood together as the sun set, two survivors holding on to each other, and the fragile belief that suffering could lead to something better, if you refuse to let it lead to nothing. The auction of Kane's ranch was held on a bright October morning, autumn turning the valley into a patchwork of gold and rust. Speculators came from Cheyenne and Laramie, wealthy ranchers looking to expand their holdings, even a railroad executive sniffing for investment opportunities. The bidding started at $5,000 and climbed quickly. 10,000, 15, 20. The numbers soared beyond what any individual Red Hollow resident could afford, and Ernie watched their faces fall as the ranch, prime land that had defined their suffering, prepared to pass into another outsider's hands. Then Old Dutch stood. $30,000, he announced. Shocked silence. Dutch was a blacksmith who'd lost 3 fingers and most of his savings to Kane's extortion. Where would he get $30,000? "I don't have it alone," Dutch continued, "but Red Hollow does. We've pooled our resources, every family, every business, every person who calls this valley home. We're buying the ranch collectively, turning it into common land for grazing, for future settlement, for making sure no single man ever controls this valley again." The auctioneer looked to Judge Blackwood, who nodded approval. $30,000 from the Red Hollow Collective, the auctioneer announced. Do I hear 35? The railroad executive started to raise his hand, then caught sight of the townspeople, all standing now, united, making it clear that whoever outbid them would be buying land surrounded by hostile neighbors. He lowered his hand. 30,000. Going once, going twice, sold to the Red Hollow Collective. The cheers this time weren't just celebration. They were vindication. The land Cain had stolen, the empire he'd built on suffering, now belonged to the people he'd tried to crush. After the auction, Ernie found himself at the Cain Ranch for the first time since the raid. The main house stood empty, windows dark, the ghost of tyranny fading in autumn light. Soon it would be repurposed, maybe a community center, maybe housing for new settlers, maybe torn down entirely to erase the memory of what it represented. Margaret joined him on the porch, surveying the valley spread below. "We did it," she said. "Actually did it. Took back what was ours." "You did it," Ernie corrected. "I just lit the match. You folks built the fire." "Don't diminish your role. You gave us permission to fight back. Showed us it was possible." She leaned against him. "What now, Ernie Hale? You've freed a town, killed the dragon, got the girl. What does a hero do after the story ends?" "I'm not a hero, just a drifter who got lucky." "You're whatever you choose to be. That's the gift of freedom. You get to define yourself instead of letting circumstances do it for you." Ernie thought about that. All his life, he'd been defined by external forces: the fire that killed his parents, the noose that almost killed him, the frontier that had shaped him into a survivor. But now, for the first time, he had actual choice. Could be anything, go anywhere, build whatever future he wanted. "I choose to stay," he said. "I choose you, this town, this valley. I choose to stop drifting and start belonging." Margaret's smile could have lit the valley. "Then I guess we're stuck with each other." "I guess we are." They held elections in November. Margaret was chosen for the town council by unanimous vote. Old Dutch became the new sheriff, a blacksmith who knew everyone and couldn't be intimidated. Doc Harrison was elected mayor, a position he accepted reluctantly and promised to surrender as soon as someone more qualified emerged. And the council formally appointed Ernie as the town's marshal, a role that made him laugh given his history of being on the wrong side of the law. "You see the irony, right?" he said when they offered him the badge. "A wanted man turned lawman." "Former wanted man," Margaret corrected. "And who better to enforce justice than someone who's seen what happens when it fails?" Ernie accepted the badge, though he wore it under his vest, never quite comfortable with the authority it represented. He wasn't a lawman in the traditional sense. Didn't patrol streets looking for trouble or enforce regulations about where people could tie their horses. Instead, he became something different. A reminder that Red Hollow wouldn't tolerate tyranny, a symbol that resistance was possible, a promise that the people who'd fought for freedom would fight to keep it. Winter came hard that year, burying the valley in snow and testing the resolve of people still rebuilding from violence and loss. Supplies ran low. Livestock died. Families huddled around fires and wondered if they'd survive to see spring. But they helped each other, shared food when neighbors ran out, checked on elderly residents during storms, cleared snow from paths so Doc Harrison could reach patients. The community that had learned to resist together now learned to endure together, and somehow that made the cold less bitter. Ernie spent that winter teaching people to shoot, not for violence, but for protection and hunting. He showed them how to assess threats, how to avoid fights when possible, and win them when necessary. Margaret taught reading and writing in the evenings, educating adults who'd never had the opportunity, making sure the next generation would be literate and informed. On Christmas Eve, the whole town gathered in the church, not for religious services, but for a community meal. They pushed the pews aside, set up tables, and shared what little they had. It wasn't much, potatoes and venison, hard bread, and weak coffee, but it tasted like victory. Old Dutch raised his cup in a toast, to those who aren't here, and to those who are. May we honor the first by building a future worthy of the second. They drank to that, to memory and hope, and the fragile belief that suffering could end if you refused to accept it as inevitable. Spring arrived like a promise kept. Snow melted, revealing a valley reborn. Families planted crops in fields they finally owned outright. The general store reopened with Ben's son at the helm, carrying his father's legacy forward. New settlers arrived, drawn by stories of a town that had freed itself. People looking for the same freedom Red Hollow had fought to claim. The town grew. New houses, new businesses, new families. Within a year, the population had doubled. Within 2 years, Red Hollow was thriving in ways it never had under Kane's control. Prosperity built on cooperation instead of exploitation, on community instead of fear. Ernie watched it happen with something between satisfaction and disbelief. He'd never built anything before, only torn things down. But here was proof that destruction could be the first step toward creation, that sometimes you had to burn away the rot before healthy growth could begin. On a warm June evening 2 years after Kane's death, Ernie and Margaret sat on the porch of the house they'd built together, a small cabin on the edge of town with a view of the valley and the mountains beyond. Margaret's hand rested on her swollen belly, 7 months pregnant with their first child. "You thinking about names?" she asked. "For a boy, maybe Samuel, after your first husband. He deserves to be remembered." Margaret's eyes grew wet. "He'd like that. And for a girl? Whatever you want. I'm terrible at names." "Somehow I doubt that." She shifted, getting comfortable. "Are you happy, Ernie? Really happy? Not just content?" Ernie considered the question carefully. Happiness was such a foreign concept, something he'd spent decades believing wasn't meant for people like him. But sitting here with Margaret, watching the sun set over a valley no longer defined by fear, feeling their child move under his hand, this felt like more than contentment. "Yes," he said, "I'm happy. Scared about being a father, worried about all the ways I'll probably mess it up, but happy." "You'll be a good father, better than you think." "How do you know?" "Because you understand what it means to fight for someone, to put their safety above your own, to build instead of just survive." She kissed him softly. "That's all parenting is, really, fighting for your children and building a world they can thrive in." As darkness fell, they sat together in comfortable silence, two broken people who'd somehow built an unbroken life. The town below them settled into night, lamps lighting windows, families gathering for meals, children being tucked into beds where they'd sleep without fear. This was what they'd fought for. Not just freedom from Kane, but freedom to build, to love, to create futures that didn't end in violence and graves. It was small and fragile and could still fail in 1,000 different ways. But it was real. And it was theirs. 3 years after Victor Kane's death, Red Hollow dedicated a memorial in the town square. Simple stone markers bearing 11 names, the people who died resisting tyranny. No grand statues, no dramatic inscriptions, just names and dates, and the understated truth that they'd mattered. Ernie stood before the memorial during the dedication ceremony, no longer wearing a badge or a collar, just standing as himself. The town had asked him to speak, and he'd reluctantly agreed. "I didn't know most of these people well," he began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Tom Rodriguez I knew for days, not years. Ben Miller I'd barely spoken to before he stood beside me. But I know what they did. They chose to fight when fighting seemed impossible, chose to stand when kneeling was safer. And they paid for that choice with everything they had." He paused, looking at the names carved in stone. "We can't bring them back. Can't undo the pain their families carry. Can't make their sacrifice fair or right, or anything except what it was, necessary and tragic in equal measure. But we can remember. We can tell our children their names. We can build a town worthy of their sacrifice. We can refuse to let their deaths mean nothing." Margaret stood beside him, holding their daughter, little Sarah, named for both Sarah Mitchell and Samuel Fairchild, a living bridge between past loss and future hope. Their son Samuel, now 18 months old, squirmed in old Dutch's arms nearby. "This valley is ours now," Ernie continued. "Not because we took it, but because we freed it. And freedom comes with responsibility. To maintain it, to protect it, to make sure no one ever controls Red Hollow the way Kane did. That's the real memorial. Not stone and names, but the world we build and the vigilance we maintain." After the ceremony, as people dispersed to celebrate with food and music and the simple joy of community, Ernie found himself alone with Margaret at the memorial. "You never wanted this," she said quietly. "Never wanted to be a leader or a symbol. You just wanted to survive." "True. But somewhere along the way, survival stopped being enough." He looked at their children, at the town beyond them, at the life they'd built from desperation and violence. I'm glad I stayed, Margaret. Glad I stopped running. Even knowing the cost, knowing what it took to get here, I'm glad. Me too, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't still have nightmares about losing you, about waking up and finding you gone, drawn back to whatever restless thing drove you before Red Hollow. That restless thing died when Cain did, or maybe it just found what it was searching for all along. He pulled her close. I'm not going anywhere. This is home. Your home. And I'm done drifting. They stood together in the square as evening fell, their children playing nearby, the memorial standing silent witness to the price of freedom and the people who'd paid it. Somewhere in the hills, Silas Cord was probably running cons or working as hired muscle, his legend diminished, but his survival instinct intact. Somewhere in Montana, Jake Cutter was learning to sleep without a gun under his pillow, trying to be something other than a killer. Somewhere in Cheyenne, bureaucrats were processing paperwork that would make Red Hollow's independence official and permanent. But here, in this small town that had learned to fight for itself, people were just living, raising children, building businesses, planning futures that extended beyond tomorrow's survival. It was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. The miracle of people choosing hope over fear, community over isolation, courage over comfort. Ernie Hale had arrived in Red Hollow wearing a dead man's collar, carrying nothing but a gun and a lifetime of running. He'd expected to drift through, maybe hide for a while, then move on before connections became complications. Instead, he'd found something worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. And in the end, that made all the difference. The sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of fire and promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, crops to plant, buildings to repair, children to educate, justice to maintain. But tonight, Red Hollow rested in the peace its people had earned through blood and sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to accept tyranny as inevitable. Ernie picked up little Sarah, felt her tiny hand grip his finger with the fierce determination of someone who'd never known fear because others had fought to keep her safe. This was the future they'd died for. Not monuments or legends, but ordinary lives lived in extraordinary freedom. And standing there in the gathering dark, holding his daughter while his wife leaned against him and his son played nearby, Ernie Hale finally understood what he'd been searching for his entire wandering life. Not salvation or redemption or any grand transformation, just belonging, just home, just the simple, profound gift of people who loved him and a place that needed him. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.